Welcome to Haunting Whispers. Tonight, as the rain falls softly, we'll share some true scary stories to help you relax and fall asleep. And comment, where are you watching from and the time you are watching this video. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. What's worse than an exorcism? It was 2 a.m. in the morning, and I was either about to ruin my friend group or start something new and strange. Exhausted but unwilling to go to sleep, I pushed off my blanket to only cover my legs and sat up on the couch I laid in. Less than 2 feet apart from me was the owner of the apartment I was in, a girl I was starting to have feelings for. I was either getting love or sex. Sex would be a natural consequence of lowered inhibitions. The chill of her apartment that these thin blankets couldn't dampen, and the fact we found ourselves closer and closer on her couch. The frills of our blankets touched like fingers. Love would be a natural consequence of our common interests, our budding friendship. For the last 3 weeks, I had texted her nearly every hour of every day, smiling the whole time. And most importantly, our little game we'd been playing since I got here. Who's the bigger freak? Who can say the most crude and wild thing imaginable? It started off as jokes. She told me A, I told her B, and we kept it going, seeing who could weird out the other. Then we moved to truths, and then to secrets. And is there really any greater love than that, to share secrets? To expose your greatest mistakes to someone else, and ask for them to accept you anyway. I didn't quite know how I felt about her yet, in a romantic sense. She was a friend of a friend. I was told by my friend to not try to date her, because she wasn't my type, and it would just end in heartbreak, and might destroy the friend group. The funny thing is, I know she was told the same. Mabel, the girl who laid beside me, texted me casually earlier that day. She mentioned she didn't know what movie to watch. I knew what movie I wanted to watch. I'd pick and pay for the movie, she'd host and cook. Now, here we were about to start love or sex. It's never both this early. That was probably my worst relationship, she said, pulling the covers close to her. Honestly, I think he was a bit of a porn addict too. Her face glowed. What's the nastiest thing you've watched? I bit my lip, gritted my teeth, and strained in the light of the TV. Our game was unspoken, but the rules were obvious. You can't just back down from a question like that. I said my sin to her and then asked, "What's yours?" She groaned at mine and then made 2 genuinely funny jokes at my expense. Nah, I said between laughs. "What's yours?" "No judgments?" she asked. "No judgments," I said. "And you won't tell the others?" "I promise." "Pinky promise," she said and leaned in close. I liked her smile. It was a little big, a little malicious. I liked that. I leaned forward and our pinkies interlocked. My heart raced. Love or sex fast approaching. She said what it was. Sorry to leave you in the dark, reader, but the story's best details are yet to come. She was so amazed at her confession, she said Jesus Christ after it. "Yeah, you need him," I joked back. Her face went dark. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked. "What? Just a joke." "No, it's not. I can see it in your eyes you're judging me." She pulled away from me. The chill of her room felt stronger than before, and my chances at sex or love moved away with her. "Dude, no," I said. "You made jokes about me, and I made one about you." She eyed me softer then, but her eyes still held a skeptical squint. "Sorry," she said. "I just know you're religious, so I thought you were going to try to get me to go to church or something." No, not really." Good old guilt settled in because her salvation was not my priority. I am Christian, just not good at it. I'm not too shabby at the love everyone part though, so that's half the battle. Well, at least I was good at loving your neighbor, but we'll get there. "Oh," she slid beside me again. Face soft, her constant grin back on. "I just had some friends really try to force church on me, and I didn't like that. I won't step foot in a church." "Oh, sorry to hear that. There's one in particular I hate, Calgary." "Oh, why?" I froze. I hope I didn't show it in my face, but I was scared as hell she knew my secret. I just took a job at Calgary. "They just suck," she said, non-committal. Did she know? What makes them suck? She took a deep breath and told me her story. At 10 years old, I wanted to kill myself. I had made a makeshift noose in my closet. I poured out my crate of DVDs on the floor and brought the crate into the closet so I could stand on it. I flipped the crate upside down so it rested just below the noose. I stepped up and grabbed the rope. I was numb until that moment. My mom left, my family hated me, and I feared my dad was going insane. The holes in the wall, welts in his own skin, and a plethora of reptiles he let roam around our house were proof. And it was so hot. He kept it as hot as hell in that house. My face was drenched as I stepped up the crate to hang myself. I hoped heaven would be cold. Heaven. That's what made me stop. I would be in heaven and my dad would be here. I didn't want to go anywhere without my dad, even heaven. Tears gushed from my face and mixed with my salty skin to make this weird taste. I don't know why, I just remember that. Anyway, I leapt off the crate and ran to my dad. I ran from the closet and into the muggy house. A little girl who needed a hug from her dad more than anything in the world. It was just him and me after all. Reptile terrariums littered the house. My dad kept buying them. We didn't even have enough places to put them anymore. I leaped over a habitat of geckos and ran around the home of bearded dragons. It was stupid. I hated the feeling that I was always surrounded by something inhuman crawling around. It hurt that I felt like my dad cared about them more than me. But I didn't care about any of that. I needed my dad. I pushed through the door of his room, but his bed was vacated, so that meant he was probably in his tub. But I knew getting clean was the last thing on his mind. I carried the rope with me, still in the shape of a noose. I wanted him to see what almost happened. I crashed inside. "Mabel, stop," he said when I took half a step in. "I don't want you to step on Leviathan." Leviathan was his python. My eyes trailed from the yellow tail in front of me to the body that coiled around my dad. Leviathan clothed my dad. It wrapped itself around his groin, waist, arms, and neck, and it was a tight hold. I had seen my father walk and even run with Leviathan on him. Today, he just sat in the tub, watching it or watching himself. I'm unsure. His mental illness confused me as a child, so I never really knew what he was doing. I was the one who almost made the great permanent decision that night, but my dad looked worse than me. His veins showed, and he appeared strained as if in a state of permanent uncomfortably. He sweat as much as I did, and I think he was having trouble breathing. The steam that formed in the room made it seem like a sauna. He was torturing himself, all for Leviathan's sake. "Dad, I..." "Close the door," my dad barked, between taking a large, uncomfortable breath. "You'll make it cold for Leviathan." "Yes, sir." I did as he commanded and shut the door. Then I ran to him. "Stop." He raised his hand to me, motioning for me to be still. He looked at Leviathan, not me. It was like they communed with one another. I was homeschooled, so there wasn't anyone to talk to about it, but it's such a hard thing to be afraid of your parents and be afraid for your parents and to need them more than anything. "Come in, honey," he said after his mental deliberation with the snake. And I did, feeling an odd shame and relief. I raised the noose up, and I couldn't find the right words to express how I felt. I settled on, "I think I need help." "Oh no," my dad said and rose from the tub. So quick, so intense. For a heartbeat, I was so scared I almost ran away. Then I saw the tears in his eyes and saw he was more like my dad than he had been in a long time. He hugged me, and everything was okay. It was okay. I was sad all the time, but it was going to be okay. The house was infested, a sauna, and a mess. But life is okay with love, you know? He cried and I cried, but snakes can't cry, so Leviathan rested on his shoulder. After an extended hug, he took Leviathan off and said he needed to make a call. When he came back, he told me to get in the car with him. I obeyed as I was taught to. We rode in his rickety pickup truck in the dead of night in complete silence until he broke it. "I was bad, Mabel baby," he said. "What?" "As a kid, I wasn't right," he said. My father randomly twitched, like someone overdosing on drugs, if you've seen that. He flew out of his lane. I grabbed the handle for stability. The oncoming semi approached, honked at us. I braced for impact. He whipped the car back over. His cold coffee cup fell and spilled in my seat. My head banged against the window. It hurt and I was confused. What was happening? The world looked funny. My eyes teared up again, making the night a foggy mess. I wasn't good as a child, Mabel baby. I was different from the others. I saw things, I felt things differently. Probably like you. He turned to me and extended his hand. I flinched under it, but he merely rubbed my forehead. "I'm sorry about that," he said. Hands on the wheel again, still twitching, still flinching. "You know you're the most precious thing in the world to me, right?" Yes, I know. We're going fast. You don't want to get pulled over, right? Oh, I wouldn't stop for them. No, Mabel baby, because your soul's on the line. I won't let you end up like me. There was no music on. He only allowed a specific type of Christian music anyway. Weird chants that even scared my traditionally Catholic friends. The horns of other drivers he almost crashed into were the only noise. What do you mean, Daddy? I was a bad kid. What did you do? I was off to myself, antisocial, sensitive, cried a lot, and I wasn't afraid of the dark, Mabel baby. I'd dig in the dark if I had to. His body convulsed at this. His wrists twisted, and the car whipped going in and out of our double yellow-lined lane. I screamed, in, out, life-threatening zigzags. Then he adjusted as if nothing happened. Daddy, I don't think you were evil. I think you were just different. This cheered him up. Yes, some differences are good, he said. We're all children under God's rainbow. Yes, I said, we're both just different. We're not bad. Then why were we treated badly? We were children of God, but we were supposed to be loved. We love each other. That's not enough, Mabel baby. The good people have to love us. But if they're mean, how good can they be? Good as God. They're closer to him than us, so we have to do what they say. But Daddy, I don't think you're bad. I don't think I'm bad. I think we should just go home. No, we're already here. They have to change you, Mabel baby. You're not meant to be this way. You'll come out good in a minute. We parked. I didn't even notice we had arrived anywhere. I locked my door. We were at a church parking lot. The headlights of perhaps 3 other cars were the only lights. He unlocked my door. I locked it back. Shadowy figures approached our car. It's okay, honey. I did this when I was a kid. They're going to do the same thing to me that they did to you. Bang, bang, bang. Someone barged against the door. They made me better, honey. The same thing they're going to do to you. My dad unlocked the door. Someone pulled it open before I could close it back. I screamed. This someone unbuckled my seatbelt and dragged me out. I still have the scars all up my elbow to my hand. Screaming didn't stop him. Crying didn't stop him. My trail of blood didn't stop him. The end of her story. And that's it. That's all I remember, she said and shrugged. Wait, what? There's no way that's all. Yep, sorry. Well? No, dude, tell me what happened. What did they do to your dad? Does it have to do with the reptiles? What did they do to you? I just remember walking through a dark hallway into a room with candles lit up everywhere and people in a circle. I think they were all pastors in Calgary. They tried to perform an exorcism. Then it goes blank. Sorry. No, that's not among the criteria for performing an exorcism. Excuse me? Are you saying I'm lying? She said with a well-deserved attitude in her voice because I might have been yelling at her. I wasn't mad at her, to be clear. I was passionate. I was a pastoral intern because I saw the good the church can do. I wanted people to get the same feeling of love and hope I got from church that I got. And more than anything, I hated when the church let down those it was supposed to protect. No, still not calm. I'm just saying a child considering suicide isn't in the criteria to perform an exorcism. Oh, maybe it's different for Calgary. No, I know it's not. And how do you know that? No, wait, you need to tell me what really happened. Need? Yeah, need. It's not just about you. This is important. I know I misspoke, but for me, it was a need. I could fix this. If I played my internship right, I could take over Calgary in a couple of years. I had to know its secrets. I could put an end to it. It's never about me, is it? She asked. Well, this certainly just isn't. It's always about you because you're good, you're Christian, and you're going to make this world better or something. What? No, come on. Where is this coming from? It's always okay because you're Christian. That's not fair. I just want to know what happened because it wasn't an exorcism. What happened? It's getting late. I think I want you to leave. Hey, no, wait. I'm doing the right thing here. Let me help you. Oh, I do not want or need your help. You think you're better than me and could somehow fix it because you're Christian. No, I think I could fix it because I have the keys to the church. Oh, she was stunned, and I saw a mischievous grin form on her face again. Well, she swallowed hard and took a deep breath. They took something from me, something that's still down there. And I'm not being metaphorical. I can feel it missing. If you lost something, let's go get it back. There was another possibility I hadn't thought of between sex or love, that I could have tonight. Adventure. But this was just the beginning, for another nightmare was waiting. I discovered something terrible on the Wayback Machine. It started on one of those Friday nights when I found myself tumbling down a digital rabbit hole. The Wayback Machine had always been my go-to when I wanted to dig into internet history and mystery. I've always found exploring the ghosts of old websites, lingering on the fringes of existence, to be interesting. I was reading old blogs, forums, and digital diaries, searching for something to entertain me and feed my imagination. It wasn't a website I recognized. The URL was strange, like an old subdomain of a now-defunct hosting site. The Reflective Mind, or something equally obscure. I'm not even sure how I ended up on the page. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, one of those late 90s or early 2000s blogs that someone created and then abandoned. The post was buried deep in the archives, the kind of page that didn't get many visitors even when it was live. He's watching, the vanity man is watching, the title read. Curiosity got the better of me, so I read on. The post was surprisingly long, much more in-depth than typical internet drivel. The writer talked about a figure, not unlike the Hat Man or the Midnight Man, but they called it the Vanity Man. It starts with a simple ritual, the post began, which immediately piqued my interest. The writer described a process that felt more clinical than supernatural, as if they were detailing any other common creepypasta or conducting a mundane experiment. There was no mention of witchcraft, no pentagrams or chanting, just an odd set of instructions. The ritual: start at midnight. In your home, turn off every light, every screen, every source of artificial light. The only thing you should see is the natural darkness around you. Find the largest mirror in your home, the one you catch glimpses of yourself in without meaning to. If you don't have one, a reflective surface will do, but a mirror is best. Stand in front of the mirror and light a single candle. Hold it in your left hand. Stare at your reflection without blinking. Not for 10 seconds, not for a minute, but for 6 full minutes. You have to stare. You can't look away, even if your eyes start to water. At the end of the 6th minute, the candle will go out on its own. Do not attempt to relight it. You'll know it's time when the mirror reflects something back at you that isn't you. The post went on, recounting the writer's own experience. I didn't believe it at first, they wrote. I thought it was just another urban legend. But when the candle snuffed itself out, and I saw him, I knew it was real. It's always watching now, just outside my vision. I can never truly see it unless I look directly into the mirror, and that's a mistake you only make once. The rest of the post was filled with frantic recounts, warnings, and regrets. The writer claimed that the Vanity Man was something ancient, something that only comes when summoned. It didn't physically attack, it didn't chase you, but it lived inside the reflection, just out of view, watching you always, a shadow behind your own. The final words on the post sent a shiver down my spine. I can feel it even now as I write this. If you find this, turn back. Don't look. Don't summon it. Don't invite it into your home. Naturally, I ignored the warning. I couldn't stop thinking about the post. Over the next few days, I found myself constantly searching for more information about the Vanity Man, but nothing concrete came up. A few scattered mentions on obscure paranormal forums, some dead links, and a couple of blurry images posted by anonymous users. But that was it. I was hoping to find more posts from the same author or blog. I recovered a few more obscure pages, others who had apparently encountered the Vanity Man. They all followed the same format. The writer would find the ritual, perform it, and then their life would fall apart. They would see him in reflections, at night, in windows, in puddles on the street. Some of the writers vanished from their online circles soon after their final posts. Others were later reported missing, or worse. My skepticism should have been enough to stop me. But there was a part of me, some reckless, insatiable part, that wanted to know if it was real. What if there was something to it? What if I could figure it out? So I decided to do the ritual and see for myself. The night was quiet. I had prepped everything exactly as described. I turned off every light, every source of electronic glow. My phone sat useless on the other side of the room, the screen completely dark. There was nothing but the stillness of my apartment and the vague reflections in the massive mirror that hung on my bedroom wall. It was 11:57 p.m. when I stood before the mirror with the single candle. My hands were trembling. The darkness was so thick, I could barely see my own reflection. I lit the candle and held it in my left hand, the flickering light casting long shadows on the walls behind me. As soon as the clock struck midnight, I began to stare. I kept my eyes focused on my own gaze, just like the instructions had said. The seconds dragged by. My eyes started to burn from the strain, but I refused to blink. After the second minute, the burning was excruciating, but I forced my eyes open, eager to prove the story wrong. I told myself it was all in my head, that nothing would happen. The minutes passed. 5 minutes, 6 minutes. That's when the candle flame began to flicker, even though there was no draft. And then it went out. I was plunged into total darkness. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see a thing, but I felt something change. The air in the room grew colder. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and thudding in my ears. I didn't want to look back into the mirror, but I couldn't stop myself. My eyes adjusted slowly, and that's when I saw it. There, standing just behind me in the reflection, was a figure. It wasn't human, not really. It was tall, almost impossibly tall, and its face was mine. Not exactly, though. The face in the mirror was a twisted, distorted version of me. Its eyes were sunken, its skin pale and gaunt. But the worst part was the expression. Its lips were pulled into a wide, unnatural grin. It was looking at me. My hair stood on end. Shivers traveled down my spine. I was completely frozen in fear. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I felt as if I had been plunged into ice-cold water. I spun around, trying to catch a glimpse of it in real life. Nothing. Just darkness. I was alone, but when I looked back at the mirror, it was still there, standing behind me, grinning. My heart racing. I backed away, my heart racing. It just stood there, staring at me through the glass, waiting. I couldn't take the sight of it anymore. I grabbed the mirror, ripping it off the wall, and threw it face down onto the floor. The crash was deafening, the glass shattering into a million pieces. For a minute, I thought it was over. I thought I was safe. But then I saw the shards. In each tiny fragment of glass, the vanity man still stared at me, grinning, hundreds of reflections watching from every angle. I finally mustered the strength to scream and ran out of my apartment. I frantically ran to my car, eager to get as far away as possible. I saw it again in my rear review mirror. I saw him in the reflections of the windows outside of my apartment. In every reflective surface, there he was. That's when I realized what the blog post meant. The vanity man doesn't live in just one mirror. It lives in every reflection. Since that night, I've covered every reflective surface in my apartment. I avoid windows, puddles, anything that can reflect. But it doesn't matter. I see it everywhere now, lurking, always smiling, always waiting. I've become a complete hermit, scared to leave my apartment, scared of my own face. The eviction notices are piling up outside my door, and I know it will be any day now that they come for me. Even when I close my eyes, I swear I can still see it standing there, just waiting for me to look. You should stop reading now. Don't search for it. Don't try the ritual. It's not worth it. Because once you've seen the vanity man, it'll never stop watching. As one horror faded, another began to take shape in the shadows. My uncle has a strange set of rules. I moved in with my uncle, who had a strange set of rules. When I was 12, I was forced to spend a summer with my great-uncle Jeremy. You see, I was a bit of a troublemaker back in those days, and my parents thought if I spent some time with my strict grouch of an uncle, I would somehow be rehabilitated. You can imagine how hard my eyes rolled when my mom and dad told me about their plan, but I was oblivious to the horrors I would endure that summer. Uncle Jeremy was somewhat of a mountain man. He lived in the remote wilderness of Montana's high pine forest. A homesteader through and through, he'd made a life where most people would go insane. Granted, Uncle Jeremy did seem a bit kooky to me at the time. My dad almost tossed me out of the car as we rolled into my uncle's mountain cabin. He didn't even wait for Uncle Jeremy to greet me at the door. I watched as Dad's little Prius made its way back down the long driveway and onto the unkempt dirt road. While I was a bit offended by how I'd just been abandoned, I was not envious of the long journey ahead of him. It took us almost 2 hours to traverse that nasty road. I was sure we'd be left stranded at one point or another. A Prius is no off-roading vehicle. The hybrid's taillights disappeared amongst the dense forest. My attention turned to the rickety wooden cabin. This house was not what you would imagine it to be. It wasn't the picturesque idea people have when they think of a log cabin. I could see the structure had been through a lot. The logs were weathered, faded by the hot Montana summer and the icy winter winds. I could tell that everything used in its construction was sourced from the surrounding forest. Likewise, no modern amenities were visible, no power lines, fire hydrants, not even a satellite dish. I knew then it was going to be a duller summer than I'd imagined. I lifted a hand to knock on the old door and stopped when I noticed a few deep scratch marks on its facade. Bears? I thought to myself. An uneasy feeling that I was being watched from the pines came over me. I cocked my head in the direction of the tree line. It felt like something was calling me over to the woods. The door squealed open, and I returned my gaze to the cabin. In the passageway stood a gray-bearded man, the fibers in his beard long, greasy, and matted. His skin was old and weathered. I suspected the same reasoning as the cabin's. He looked at me through the gray film in his eye. I'd never actually met Uncle Jeremy up until that point, but I'd heard stories about him from my father. My father had suffered the same fate as me the summer between 7th and 8th grade. He told me Uncle Jeremy was not a man to be trifled with. You listen to everything your Uncle Jeremy tells you. He is not a man you want to make angry. My father would lecture, but when I looked into the face of the withering man, I didn't sense an ounce of animosity. He almost seemed kind. Nothing resembled the ferocity my father had mentioned. "Hi, I'm Marcus." I outstretched my hand in the introduction, but he slapped it away before placing a hand over my mouth. "Shh, we don't say names here." He moved my head over to the side to make sure no one or nothing was listening. More of my father's description of my great-uncle came to mind. "Uncle Jeremy is a bit strange, but he has your best interest in mind. Try your best to ignore his lack of civility." The words were all starting to make sense now. Uncle Jeremy ushered me into the cabin, and I thought I heard him whisper my name as he pushed me inside. That is until I turned to see the look of fear in his eyes. I knew then that the sound had drifted in on the early summer breeze, somewhere beyond the tree line, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood. "Is everything okay, Uncle Jeremy?" His open palm slapped my cheek as I spoke his name. "Damn it, kid, I told you no names," he said through gritted teeth before returning his gaze to the tree line. Almost like a dream, a faint voice slithered into the cabin. "Jeremy," the voice called. "What the hell is that?" I asked, but received no reply. Uncle Jeremy quickly slammed the door shut. "Rule number 1, no names." I dropped my gaze at his reprimand. "Rule number 2, if you hear something strange, leave it be. Ignore it. You hear me?" I pondered his instructions before moving to question his logic. "Why?" "Not another word on the matter. Those are the rules. My only rules. You follow them or I'll send you back to your little life in Boise. You hear me?" Just then my escape from homestead living became clear. Break a few rules here and there, and I'd be back in the gem state. I tried not to smile at the plot that was formulating in my mind. "Your room is down yonder." The old man pointed down a small hallway before leading me to it himself. We stepped into a small 10 by 10 room. I threw my backpack onto the bed and plopped down right beside it, giving a grunt of relief. "What do you think you're doing, kid? This isn't some luxurious mountain retreat." I eyed the crumbling wooden walls. The understatement of the century, I thought to myself. We have work to do. He moved to the window and pushed open the shutters, taking in a lungful of pristine mountain air in the process. Beyond his gaze stood a 2-acre clearing in the forest, a mix of fields more comparable to glorified gardens and livestock, chickens, goats, and 1 cow. He turned to me and noted my disappointed face. "What, you think this was a free ride? No, we work for our food here," he said with the first ounce of enjoyment I'd seen inch across his face. He pulled open a drawer on the nightstand. "I placed these here for you before you got here." I peered into the drawer to find some old torn overalls. "You put those on and meet me outside. There's a lot to get done around here. The faster we get it over with, the faster we can have ourselves a nice supper." Later that night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep. All of my muscles were aching. Uncle Jeremy was not lying. Homestead living is not for the weak. We'd worked until the sun met the horizon, and this time of year in Montana, that was around 9:30 p.m. We'd weeded the fields, fed the chickens, and milked the dairy cow whose name I found out to be Bessie, and done dozens upon dozens of other tasks that were not very enjoyable. The best thing about it was that Uncle Jeremy said we would do it all again the next day. I placed the pillow over my face, hoping that it would suffocate me. I was a beat dog that needed to be put out of its misery. The warmth of the plush fabric seemed to comfort me a bit, so I left it there as the night slowly started to wash over me. Just as I was about to fall into an uneasy night of sleep, I heard scratching from the other side of the wall. It was coming from outside. The sound was very faint. It almost reminded me of the time we had mice inside the walls back home, only these walls were not hollow, they were solid lumber. I moved the pillow off to the side, making sure that nothing muted the scraping by my head. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The noise sounded rhythmic, almost as if someone was sending a message. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Whatever it was clawing deeper into the side of the cabin. Whatever was making the noise was too strong to be a mouse, a raccoon maybe. Then the sound intensified to a loud, ear-piercing screech, like someone clawing at an old chalkboard. Screech, screech, screech. I shot to a seated position. It must have been a bear. Montana grizzlies scared the shit out of me, part of the reason why I'd never come to meet Uncle Jeremy in the first place. I heard the same faint whisper that had come from the tree line earlier that day. Only this time, instead of Uncle Jeremy's name, my name hissed in through the cracks of the cabin. Marcus! I looked at the shutters on the window, and my heart dropped when I saw something slowly pulling them open. Uncle Jeremy! I shouted. From down the hall, I heard a bedroom door smash open, followed by my room's door. Uncle Jeremy stood there holding his .22 in hand, his eyes meeting mine, before noticing the slowly creeping shutters. He leaned the gun on the wooden wall before running over to the shutters and forcing them closed. He quickly locked the latch before turning to me. Kid, I had 2 rules, and you broke both of them the first night. He shouted at me while I was still trying to make sense of what just happened. I was hoping that the more my uncle talked, the more the situation would clear up. But everything he said just made me more confused and frankly terrified. Now you've done it, kid. It now knows our names. It's imprinted on us. You have no idea how hard it was to get rid of the last one. The last one? I thought. What are you talking about? I quivered. Never mind that. From now on, you keep these shutters locked here. He didn't have to tell me twice. The whole house is going to be locked down, and just so we're clear, if you hear me calling your name, it ain't me. What the hell? What else could it be? I opened my mouth to ask a clarifying question. What is it? I said. What's my second rule? My uncle commanded. I pondered for a bit before responding. If I see something, leave it be. That's right. Leave it be. No more of this. We will not talk about it anymore. It will only encourage it. Suddenly, I no longer wanted to go through with my plot to get Uncle Jeremy to send me home. The next morning after breakfast, Uncle Jeremy and I stepped outside to inspect the side of my wall where the noise was coming from. Uncle Jeremy touted a gun belt today, a Magnum revolver in its sheath. When we gazed at the marks on the wall, I was sure that no grizzly had created the noise. These scratches were not random like the ones on the door. No, these markings were indeed a message. Drawn on the wooden logs was a cryptic symbol, a circle with 3 jagged lines drawn through it. On top of this circle were 2 names, Jeremy and Marcus. I gulped as Uncle Jeremy got a closer look. He gave a nervous chuckle. He'll be back tonight, he said in a tone that desired itself to be false. My stomach fluttered in fear. Bessie, the dairy cow, gave an agonizing moo. I could tell that something was bothering her. Uncle Jeremy turned with a sad look on his face. He took to his feet and walked his way over to the cow. When he was feet away from her, he took to one knee. It's already begun. I looked over his shoulder, and my mouth dropped when I saw the sight of gore that still torments me to this day. Bessie's udders were mutilated, flesh hanging off of each of the protrusions, and flies feasting on her fresh wounds as blood mixed with fresh milk. Poor Bessie, Uncle Jeremy said. I could tell that seeing his cow suffer made him emotional, I moved to comfort him, but before my hand could grace his shoulder, he stood. He unholstered the magnum and pointed it at Bessie's head. One shot rang out as every bird in the vicinity took flight. Bessie was dead. She now lay in a pool of blood and brain matter. Uncle Jeremy wiped away some tear before turning around and walking briskly back to the cabin. "Come on, kid, we have to get ready." I knew that we were heading for some kind of battle. When the night fell on the cabin that day, Uncle Jeremy and I did not talk. We had barricaded ourselves and all of the livestock inside the little cabin. A total of 22 chickens, 7 goats, and a variety of domesticated geese. He'd thrust a rifle in my hand and give me instructions on how to shoot, though he said not to use it unless something happened to him. For the most part, the night was quiet. The chickens and geese had rusted for the night, and the goats had lost the excitement of being in a new environment. They now huddled together in a corner of the living room. I would almost say it was peaceful, until every animal began screeching at the top of their lungs. The birds flocked around the house. The goats erupted in a panic, running around trying to find any hiding place they could. Most now cowered under the dining room table. Almost as quickly as the commotion began, it all quieted down. I looked at Uncle Jeremy in bewilderment, but the look in his eye told me he'd seen all of this before. His eyes trained on the door. A familiar sound slid across the other side of the door. It was the scratching that we'd heard the night before. In the same fashion, the scratching intensified before it erupted into a frenzy of banging. I eyed the door as the latch struggled to keep whatever was on the other side out. A voice soon followed suit. "Jeremy, Jeremy, Jeremy." "Oh, Uncle Jeremy." It sounded like me. For some reason, whatever was on the other side was using my voice to bait my uncle to the door. The voice changed to that of Uncle Jeremy's. "Marcus, open the door, Marcus." Uncle Jeremy looked at me before raising his revolver to the door. One shot rang out, and the sound of something hitting the floor was evident from our vantage point. My uncle took to his feet and made his way over to the door, revolver at the ready. I wanted to tell him to stay put, but couldn't find the courage. He opened the top latch, followed by the bottom. The door cautiously creaked open, and Uncle Jeremy peered out the small crack. I will remember the words that came from his mouth for the rest of my life. "Oh shit." Suddenly, a clawed hand reached through the small crack in the door and pulled him from the comforts of the cabin. I heard screams, but wasn't sure if they belonged to Uncle Jeremy or the thing impersonating him. Everything went quiet, and I wrestled with the idea of seeing what the outcome of the skirmish was. Just then, I heard a voice that brought me a mountain of relief. "It's okay, kid. I got him." I heard Uncle Jeremy grunt as he seemingly took to his feet from the other side of the door. But as the door slowly swung open, my heart dropped. It wasn't my uncle. It was the creature that had taken him. Its body was tall and skinny, its skin pale, and its face, well, it had no face, just a plain identity. But as it stood there and turned in my direction, a mouth began to part, skin sticking to its upper and lower jaws until they eventually gave way to jagged teeth. It spoke one more time in my uncle's voice. "Marcus." It took to a sprint, and when it was just feet from me, a revolver round spat out. The creature flopped to the floor in a green pool of blood. Standing at the door was my injured Uncle Jeremy. After that night, I had no problems with following any of Uncle Jeremy's rules, no matter how arbitrary they were. We worked his homestead all summer, and I never mentioned his name again. I was never one for the rules, but in this instance, I was not going to summon another creature. Although I would see things dart around beyond the tree line, I never mentioned them. At the end of the summer, I was adamant that I would never spend another summer with my Uncle Jeremy, a model citizen through and through. 10 years later, I received word that my great-uncle Jeremy had passed. At first, I suspected old age. He was ancient after all, but my father informed me that it had been a bear attack that ended his life. He was a hard son of a bitch, and a hard son of bitch deserved to go out like a man, I thought to myself. But then I started to question if a bear was really the culprit. My thoughts turned to the creature that once called from the other side of the cabin walls. I thought of its blank face and its jagged claws. The day before I was set to leave for his funeral, I received a letter in the mail. The address it was sent from was Uncle Jeremy's P.O. box. I'd assumed he'd left something in his will for me, but as I unsealed the letter, I found a single piece of paper. Written in blood was the same circle Uncle Jeremy and I had found carved on the other side of the cabin walls, the lines drawn across it just as jagged. Look to the top of the circle, the same two names were written out. Only this time, one was crossed out, Uncle Jeremy's. At that second, I heard faint scratching from the other side of my house in Idaho. I don't know how, but one of them found me. If you think that was terrifying, wait until you hear what happened next. The American Sleep Experiment. For previous parts, watch our previous video. Day 16. I honestly don't even know if that's the right day. At this point, everything is blurring together. I'm on 8 days, I believe, of no sort of sleep whatsoever. The feeling of electricity in my spine is the only thing keeping me going at this point, making it impossible to stay still or fall into any kind of rest. The auditory hallucinations have gotten much worse, and now I can clearly hear the numerous horrors inside the subject room. Even worse, the smells are beginning to come through as well, only adding to the stench of excrement and old viscera exuding from the observation room. Nothing I've done has worked. I've tried a few methods of killing myself at this point. Hanging was ineffective, leaving me with nothing but a bruised neck and trouble breathing since. Taryn made it obvious that blood loss wouldn't do anything, so that was useless. An attempted drowning in the bathtub was cut short when I realized asphyxiation wouldn't do anything, just like when I hung myself. Probably for the best, because that was an awful, awful feeling. My last attempt was at a tried and true classic, the Reaper's bath bomb. I plugged in the air fryer from the kitchen, figuring a toaster just might not have the oomph I need. Fill the bath, turn the fryer on 400, and let me cook. I can still smell something burning, probably my internal organs, considering everything still feels like it's on fire. The aches aren't going away, and I'm not sure that I'll be able to stay alive once I'm finally out of this. Assuming I ever am. I'm gonna search for other ways. If push comes to shove, we have some drugs in the medical bay, but I'm honestly not holding out hope at this point. Day 17. I'm starting to see things. Whatever the noises are coming from, whatever the others have been seeing, they're finally starting to appear for me. They're not in focus, though. It's like looking through a patterned glass window. Their basic shape is there, but everything is blurry or mismatched. Colors end where they shouldn't, and others warp, so nothing is clearly distinguishable. I'm terrified of what I'm going to see when they become more clear, as what's already showing is horrifying. Some of the figures gathered around one are terrifying, with many just having large, red prisms of color where heads should be. Meanwhile, most of the ones around two are wearing a bright pink, and the singing is something I can hear no matter where I am. It never stops. I've seen water dripping on the floor here and there from seemingly nowhere, but I now see it's due to those gathered around three. Their screams are some of the worst, like someone shrieking at the top of their lungs underwater, only bubbles escaping as liquid fills their airways. I can only imagine this is the sound they were making when they died. 5 hasn't stopped banging at the door, and I still don't know what it is that's surrounding him. There are just mounds? Not people figures, like the others. Okay, some are more humanoid, I guess, but others are just massive piles. The worst thing is it looks like they're burning, molten embers pulsing among dark gray and black fractals of light. Philip is catatonic at this point, but I think it's more because he's shutting down from stress. I believe he's at the point of audible hallucinations, so I would imagine he's hearing the same things I am. Whatever is around him, the sounds are of screams and flames, a smell of charred flesh lingering in the air. 4 seems to have gone feral, and we locked him in his room due to the signs he was exhibiting. Whether it's just a psychosis exhibiting rabies-like symptoms or not, that's a whole other hell we aren't willing to bring in here. He was almost howling in his delirium, hair matted and skin glistening in sweat as he tore at it, trying to get something out of himself. I know there's someone behind me too. I know who they are. I know why they're here. I just can't bear to face that. Murray has checked in on me from time to time. I believe he's in the same state of audio hallucinations, but has yet to get a grasp of everything. The only other guard still alive has expended every bullet he could find from the security room, putting each one into his own head, one at a time from every possible direction to try and end his suffering. He's still sitting in there, clicking an empty gun against what remains of his jaw. The top and back of his head are mostly gone, one eye lolling out of the skull to stare at the gun as it clicks again, empty. His lower jaw is mostly gone, but he's still trying to speak. Or just crying, sobbing in loud, dreadful screams that gurgle through a mangled throat. I have noticed one constant, no matter where I go, and it's not the one that's attached to me. This figure is clearer, made up millions of refracting and morphing beams of light, every color I could think of and beyond. I think it was human, and the face was kind, even welcoming, but no matter how close I tried to get to it, it was like I was being pulled away. It was staying in the same place, but I just couldn't reach it. Like infinity was standing between us at any given moment. No matter how long or fast I walked towards it, an eternity passed while getting no closer. I don't know what this is, but I believe it may be the key to stopping all of this. Day 18. The figures are growing clearer now. Jesus, these images are worse than any nightmare I could conjure up, even after my worst bouts of sleeplessness. They're still not totally there, but now they're less broken, I guess is the best way to put it. It looks like I'm watching old footage off a flip phone camera, like someone tried to make a horror movie on one. The girls still dancing in circles around Bob, too, occasionally taking a leave from their spot to kick or hit him, where the Frankensteined, mangled corpses of girls cobbled together. There were stitches along their necks, and eyes were missing from some. There was this horrible makeup like a harlequin doll that was on their face. The pink dresses they wore were stained with scarlet blood, right in their abdomens. Two was approaching the same state of lucidity as Wang. One has been in since a few days ago. He's not taking things as well, though, with mostly unintelligible screams before one of the little girls uses their high heel shoes to stomp into his face. I can see from the observation window one of his eyeballs skewered through one little girl's stiletto heel. If we're being honest, I was rooting for them. At least someone was getting some good out of this situation. Four and his things, they've begun to rip each other apart. First he made a lunge at one of them. Then they all started going at it, beginning to rip him limb from limb while biting his flesh. Hospital gowns flapped as they ran, showing bare asses that would have been comical if not for the savage gore staining the gowns. One was still in high spirits somehow, despite now being riddled with bullet holes. At some point, I heard a much louder bang than usual and checked the room to see that the caved-in part of his skull was now wide open, brains splattering the wall behind them. Despite that, he was still jovial, congratulating one of his many phantoms on their great aim. All that he got back was a gurgling scream from one that was missing its entire upper skull, face consisting of nothing but lower jaw and flapping tongue. It must have been in control of the shots, because something else hit him, splattering gore through the front of his shirt, just like what happened on the exam table all those days ago. Taryn is just hanging by a thread, though she's gone mostly catatonic now as well. There's an older man who keeps hovering around her, though he simply glares from afar instead of doing anything. I've lost track of the times I've woken up, so to speak, unsure of where I am or how I got there. It's just moments of blacking out here and there, without any telling what could be happening in between points A and B. Philip, I don't know what's happening to Philip. He's lately taken to sitting in his cot, covering his ears, and just screaming at the top of his lungs. His pleas alternate between apologies and begging for his life, but he's screaming as if he's trying to be heard over a cacophony of terrible sounds. To his credit, that is the case, as the two figures near him are screaming in constant, shrieking pain. They're just pillars of fire standing beside him at all times. He's been complaining of the heat in between fits, saying that he's burning up, and I can see why. Finally, the issue is confronting my own demon, so to speak. I can see her clearly now, the exact same way she looked when she died. Peaceful, for once, instead of screaming in delirium about the thing that was after her. It was as if she had gone in her sleep, though that wasn't the case at all. She was there, awake, screaming in delusions and convulsing as the prion ate away at her brain, taking any semblance of peace from her for the 6 months before she died. All I can hear most of the time are muffled screams, the last things I heard from her. God, I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry that I brought myself to this. I just wanted to help myself, help anyone like us. I'm so sorry. I've been gone? I guess that's the best way to put it. I don't know if it was some kind of trauma response paralysis from the lack of sleep or the hallucinations taking hold. By my calendar, it should be day 25. I don't know how I'm missing an entire week, but things since I've been gone have begun to rapidly deteriorate. Taryn is barricaded in the kitchen, knife in hand and pointing it at anything that comes near. She keeps complaining of a pounding pain in her head, right at the base of her skull. The old man was still standing across the room, only glaring at her from afar and muttering under his breath. Greasy wisps of hair were slicked back over a bald spot, and his eyes were full of hatred. The way he was staring at her was lopsided, though, his head bent sideways at an awkward angle, with bone jutting from where it was crooked at. Everything was so clear now. It was like making the switch from an old box television to 4K, with everything in terrifying detail. The smell and sound of the damned around us was something that haunts me, even while I'm awake, and I'll likely never forget for the rest of my hopefully short life. When I tried to find Philip, he was only a smoldering corpse, desperately wheezing for breath on the floor. The pillars of flame were still gathered near him, looking down at his charred body as he begged for death. I found 5 in the main room, now surrounded by piles of ashen, burned limbs. Mangled torsos, hands, arms, and even heads here and there were piled around, all still burning with smoke coming off. The smell of gunpowder was thick, making my nose sting as I entered. The hands were moving toward his burnt body, desperately trying to pull him further into the ground, toward whatever hell could still be waiting for us after this. He didn't even try to fight, simply insisting that they deserved it, every single one of them. I could hear distant explosions, echoes of a land of death somewhere far beyond here. Despite everything, the constant figure was still there. Right on the edge of my vision, far away yet close enough to reach out and touch if I just gave it my all. Yet it was never enough. It never came closer, and I could never actually reach it. And it was like trying to throw a punch underwater as soon as I got close enough to think I would touch it. It almost looked sad to see that I couldn't reach it, and at one point extended a hand to me as well, almost like it was trying to help me get away. I could see cosmos flowing through its body, bright stars and nebulas dotting it up and down. Every time I looked into its eyes, it was like seeing 2 neutron stars collide, a magnificent light that makes everything else seem dull in comparison. If only I could reach it. But even when it gave me its hand, our fingers were never destined to touch. I was trapped in boundless infinity, close but never close enough to touch. I'm going to try coming up with a plan to escape. I can at least get Taryn and Murray out of here with me, but everyone else is a lost cause. They can stay in this hell for all I care. Some stories end in darkness, but others are born from it. I got invited to an obscure experimental concert. It changed my life forever. I saw another one today. It was spray painted above the entrance to a sewer, along with an arrow pointing downward into the darkness. 20 years later, MVSH is finally back in town. MVSH, 4 little letters. I know it's stupid to be scared of them, just as I know that no one is likely to remember me as the person I was 20 years ago. None of that helps when the memories come flooding back. The summer I turned 17, my life was about music. Grimy basement mosh pits, drunken field concerts where the amps were plugged into some survivalist's gas generator, night drives with the windows down and the radio blaring. A part-time job at Sundown Records paid bums to buy beer for me and kept my gas tank needle half an inch from empty. My parents bit their nails about my future, but I didn't care. Why shouldn't life just go on like this forever? Working at Sundown Records had another perk as well. I got to spend time with Dylan Fuse. He was a big name in the local underground scene, and his music shop reflected it. The walls were covered with the concert flyers of bands he'd discovered and made great. The high-end sound system played only music that met his own exacting standards. My interview at sundown was just to listen to 3 songs and tell Dylan what I thought of them. When I told him I thought they all sucked, a polished white smile flashed across his face. He put his crocodile skin shoes up on his desk and told me that the job was mine if I wanted it. Dylan gave me tips on all the most exclusive shows, even let me borrow albums from the shop. He was charming, he was worldly, and unlike the boys in my high school, he actually knew how to dress himself. It wasn't long before I was head over heels in love with him. That was how it started. I was breaking down cardboard boxes in the hallway beside his office when the phone rang. My heart skipped a beat. Nobody dared to call Dylan after 5 p.m., not unless it was an emergency. I still remember the giddiness in Dylan's voice when I pressed my ear against the door to eavesdrop. "Really? They are? I'll be there." Dylan burst out into the hallway just as I got back to my heap of cardboard. "Big news, V," he was yelling. "MVSH is playing this weekend." I'd missed a key word in there. It had sounded like his mouth had suddenly filled up with half-chewed meat. Dylan rolled his eyes at my blank expression. Apparently, MVSH was the hottest thing on the scene right now. No one knew who the band members were, where they were from, or even how to pronounce their group's name. MVSH didn't even sell tickets to their concerts. The only way in was to show up with a specific food item. It served as proof that you had been told about the show by someone close to the band. I nodded along to Dylan's story, not trusting myself to speak. When I was alone with him, my words tangled themselves into stupid, humiliating knots. I always wound up talking to my shoes, and half the time I had no idea what I had actually said to him. I was thinking about how unfair that was when I realized that Dylan had just invited me to go see MVSH with him. Sure, I guess I finally managed to shrug. My boss must have seen right through my attempt to look careless. There was a sneer on his face as he peered out into the shop. He wanted to make sure no one overheard what he was about to say next. I got goosebumps as he leaned in close and whispered, "Well then, there are a few other things you're going to need to know." I had it all planned out. I waited until my father had finished 3/4 of his coffee and reached the sports section of the newspaper before I asked him if I could stay over with my friend Sarah on Friday night. We had a biology exam on Monday. I lied, and Sarah wanted to study together. My father glanced up sharply, and I knew I was busted. I had been an idiot to suggest that I cared about school. He knew me better than that. He gazed out the window, brushed some crumbs off of his tie, and sighed, "Sure, honey, you can go, but you're bringing Raquel." Trying to hide the horrified expression on my face, I gave him a quick hug and bolted out the door. This was going to ruin everything. The difference between my sister Raquel and I was clear just by looking at our notebooks. Hers were neat, detailed, each perfectly shaped letter contained inside the lines. Mine were jumbled and chaotic, filled with stickers, doodles, and my friends' phone numbers. If I tried to leave Raquel alone at Sarah's, she would rat me out for sure. My only option was to bring her to see MVSH as my guest and hope that I could convince her to follow Dylan's bizarre instructions. The afternoon before the concert, we raided the heaps of donated clothes in the Methodist church basement. We were searching for the ugliest, filthiest stuff we could find. Dylan said that MVSH didn't let anyone in unless they looked like they had been sleeping in a dumpster for a few weeks. I told Raquel that we could throw everything away after the concert anyway. Gross. My sister made a face. I took a deep breath and did my best to explain to Raquel that seeing MVSH live was a life-changing experience. Did she really think that Dylan Hughes would be wrong about something like that? If she did, she kept her mouth shut about it, finally settling on a pair of paint-splattered khaki pants and a greasy orange t-shirt. The jeans and tuxedo vest that I'd picked out for myself were in tatters, but at least they fit me, and sort of matched. I was especially proud of a leather belt I'd discovered in a dusty corner beneath some trash bags. Its steel buckle was brick-heavy and handmade in the shape of a grinning skull. Now there was just one last stop to make before we caught a bus to the location that Dylan had given me. "What's with the soup?" Raquel asked later, when she saw me pocketing 2 packets of bouillon cubes at the mini-mart across from the bus station. I repeated Dylan's instructions. When you go to a MVSH concert, you've got to bring something that shows you know somebody cool. You know, like a password. This time, it's chicken soup cubes. We got lucky. Dylan says that one year it was oatmeal, and last time it was pig's blood. Hey, Raquel hurried after me, whispering, "You're gonna pay for that, right?" I got us a coin locker across from some broken-down payphones. As we stored our stuff, I reminded Raquel that she couldn't bring anything into the show with her. No wallet, no phone, nothing. For punks, these guys sure have a lot of rules, Raquel complained, but handed over her shoulder bag anyway. When the bus arrived, Raquel sat in the front seat, her spine straight and her hands folded neatly in her lap. I lounged beside her, drumming my fingers impatiently on the windows and hoping she wouldn't realize how nervous I was. I had assumed that Dylan would be fine with me inviting one extra person. But what if he wasn't? Our stop was near the end of the line, its crazily leaning sign barely visible in the amber streetlight glow. I was expecting some gritty industrial club with steel shutters and a line of leather-clad hipsters at the door, but the sidewalk was empty. The factories and warehouses looming over us were either closed down or partly demolished. Mangy cats prowled through the weed-choked lots. The only sign of life was a pair of white semi-trucks backed up against one of the decrepit buildings. For the first time, I found myself doubting my boss's intentions. What if Dylan was just toying with me? What if the whole thing was just some kind of cruel joke? Raquel and I slipped through a gap in a chain-link fence, then turned down a blind alley. At the far end, MVSH was spray-painted above a rusted factory door. A crowd had already started to gather. Their clothes were just ragged as ours, and there was a packet of bullion tubes in every hand. I spotted Dylan's silky smooth hair right away. We had made it. As my boss approached, that feeling of relief vanished. Without his expensive clothes and soft lighting of the record shop, Dylan looked old. He licked his lips when he saw me, and suddenly I wanted to puke. I wondered what an adult man was doing inviting a teenage girl to an event like this, then wondered why it had taken me so long to ask that question in the first place. The hungry expression on his face soured when he saw Raquel at my side. "Who's this?" "My sister Raquel. I specifically told you that there's only one invite per guest." "Right. You invited me, and I invited my sister." I found myself getting angry on Raquel's behalf. Who did Dylan think he was? She had just as much of a right to be here as anyone else. If it's a problem, we can just leave. No problem. Dylan clearly still thought he had a chance. He looked at Raquel's outfit and snorted. "Just act like you don't know me when you get to the door, okay?" "That won't be hard." Raquel snorted. There was a sarcastic edge to her voice that I had never heard before, and it occurred to me that maybe my sister was more than just the whiny teacher's pet that I had always believed her to be. Maybe during these long years of high school, she had changed too. A breeze blew down the alley, carrying dust, ripped up plastic bags, and soggy newspaper pages. One of them stuck to Dylan's pants, and he pried it off with 2 fingers as though it were some disgusting laboratory experiment. "So do these guys always keep their audience waiting forever?" Raquel asked. "Or are we special?" Dylan, usually so glib and sarcastic in his office, suddenly had nothing to say. At the far end of the alley, the factory door opened with a metallic screech. We all clapped, even Raquel, but our cheers died in our throats when we saw the 6 hulking figures that walked out of it. If they were bouncers, they were the most intimidating security team that I had ever seen. It wasn't just how eerily similar they all looked, with their bald heads and pale skin. It wasn't even how large they were. It was their eyes. There was no emotion in them at all. The 6 of them were surveying the crowd like we were cattle waiting to be processed. I had been to concerts with sketchy security, sometimes motorcycle gangs or ex-convicts, but this was different. Something was wrong. Before I could express what I was feeling to Raquel, the line started to move. The 6 strangers were even more disturbing up close. Something about their pasty skin reminded me of cold porridge or graying meat left out to spoil. Their outfits were made of stitched-together strips of ragged old clothing that looked a lot like ours. 2 of them were scanning the concert-goers with metal-detecting wands. Raquel gripped my arm. "I have a phone," she whispered. "What?" I snapped. I wasn't worried about not getting in. I was concerned about what those pale strangers might do to us if we gave them an excuse to do it. Dylan had made it clear that MVSH was ruthless about enforcing their weird rules, and if they dragged us out of line here, in an industrial wasteland far from any help, anything might happen. Dad said I couldn't go unless I brought it. I bit my lip and held out my hand to Raquel. Hand it over. Using Dylan's broad back as cover, I slipped my sister's cell phone down the front of my pants. If it triggered the metal detectors, I could just point to the steel belt buckle that was covering it. They wouldn't investigate further, I hoped. The closer we got to the six of them, the less confident I felt. Those beady black eyes never seemed to blink, and there was a smell to them, something irony and astringent that I couldn't quite identify. Raquel looked over her shoulder at me as rough hands separated us. Their metal-detecting wands moved over our bodies. Raquel disappeared through the lightless factory door just as my belt buckle set off a horrible electronic whine. The large figure in front of me pointed wordlessly at it. Forcing my mouth into a sheepish smile, I took the buckle off for closer inspection. As I did, I shook the phone further down my pant leg. The strangers passed the buckle around, then handed it back to me. Their metal detectors passed over my hips and thighs, but there was nothing there to trigger them anymore. Looking almost disappointed, they waved me through. I couldn't see anything, but from the way the crowd pressed up against me, I guessed we were in some kind of corridor. I called out to Raquel, but she didn't respond. I had an awful feeling that if I stopped or stubbled, I would be trampled to death by a mass of shuffling hipster feet. Everyone had gotten over the shock of the six strangers at the door. People murmured and shoved each other forward, eager to see what MVSH had in store for them next. We filed out into a much larger space, and stage lights came on above. It was a sort of square room that had been set up on the factory floor, with solid metal walls that were about 3 times my height. The stage hung overhead, casting fractured shadows onto the excited faces around me. When MVSH walked out on stage, the applause was scattered. The band members were the same 6 grim, burly figures who had been working security outside. What the hell was going on? A hairy hand squeezed my shoulder, and I jumped. Dylan was right behind me. He kept jabbing his finger at the walls and shouting something, but the band had already started playing. I couldn't have heard him even if I'd wanted to. It was easy to lose him in the crowd. Dylan had been right about one thing. I had never heard anything like MVSH before. When they began their first set, the droning buzz felt like I had stuck my head into a hornet's nest. The chug-chug-chug of the bass reminded me unnervingly of chomping teeth. People glanced at the faces around them, unsure. Was this really the band we had all gone through so much trouble to see? Despite their doubts, the crowd began to dance along to the music, probably hoping, like I was, that what we were hearing was just a build-up to something less disturbing. I bounced and swayed along with the rest of them. I wanted to lose myself in the music, to forget about the sense of unease that Dylan's wild-eyed expression had left me with. I kept seeing the same face as I moved through the audience, which was more tightly packed than ever, but there was no sign of Raquel. That nagging sense of wrongness was getting stronger and stronger. Sprinklers switched on overhead, soaking us all with oily, lukewarm water. The dance floor filled with the out-of-place cozy scent of chicken broth. The bouillon cubes we'd all brought with us were dissolving. The nasty liquid puddled around our feet, making the metallic walls and floor even more slick than they already were. Someone threw a shoe at the band. I was no longer the only one looking around anxiously for an exit. About half the crowd was loving it, or at least they had convinced themselves that they were. They slam-danced in a sweaty, frenzied mosh pit just below the stage, oblivious to the creeping claustrophobia that the rest of us felt. That was where I finally spotted Raquel, spinning her wet hair and pumping one fist above her head. She was having the time of her life. The hipster beside me bumped into me. He blinked, wiped water from his expensive glasses confusedly, then turned back to the band. It didn't make sense. We had both been standing still. No one had slammed into us or forced us to collide with one another, which left only one explanation. The room was somehow getting smaller. Was that what Dylan had meant when he had pointed to the walls? that they were moving somehow. Squeezing through all those slimy bodies to reach my sister probably took just a few minutes, but it felt like it took hours. Raquel threw her arms around me. I wasn't sure what she was screaming, but from her big grin, I understood that she was thanking me for bringing her here. Her smile faded when she saw the worried look on my face, the way I kept pointing away from the stage. I tugged on Raquel's arm, but her slick skin slipped right through my fingers. She shook her head, and her disgusted glare showed me exactly what she was thinking. She had spent all those years studying, all those years being the good daughter while I went out and had fun. And now I was trying to drag her away from her first night out. Raquel shoved me away and started dancing harder than ever. The soup-reeking water was almost knee-high and rising. Up on stage, MVSH hammered on their instruments. Did they even know how to play them? Or were they just making as much noise as possible to cover the rumble of the engines hidden inside the walls? By the time Raquel and the rest of the audience realized what was happening, it would be too late. Sticky flesh and wet clothing pressed in on me from all sides. The claustrophobic feeling made me want to scream, and eventually, that's exactly what I did. My shrieking became so loud that I could almost hear it over the music, but nobody nearby paid me any attention. They were convinced that this was what they had come here to see. No matter how much I squirmed, I just couldn't move. Only when the pressure had pushed my belt buckle so deeply into my skin that it hurt did I think of the phone I had smuggled in with me. I twisted my arm until I could reach into my jeans and pull it free. The rectangular screen glowed like a lighthouse beacon on the dim dance floor. The band stopped playing. An angry cry rose from all sides. I had broken MVSH's rules. Through the wall of irritated faces, I caught a glimpse of Raquel, looking more furious than any of them. Someone swatted at the device in my hand, and suddenly I was being shoved, lifted, pulled in all directions by a mob of strangers. I kept a death grip on the phone, fighting to punch 3 digits into the screen. 911. One of the MVSH members grabbed some long, cruel-looking tool that reminded me of a noose on a pole. It closed around my neck, dragging me backwards over all those angry anonymous hands onto the stage. I clawed helplessly at the rubber cord that was cutting off my air supply. The audience cheered. "Please let me go," I whimpered. "911, what's your emergency?" A cheery voice blared from the phone's speaker. The crowd fell silent. The MVSH members looked at each other. One grabbed me by the arm and dragged me off stage. The others picked up their instruments, ready to continue their performance. "Hello, this is 911. Please state your emergency." The operator's words echoed eerily from the abandoned factory walls. I was being taken back out the corridor we had walked in through, toward the alley door. The MVSH member tightened his grip around my bicep until I thought my arm would snap in half. He hadn't said a word, but the message was clear. He could beat me to death a long time before the police could arrive. Remain on the line, and first responders will... "Oh, geez," I apologized. "I must have called by accident. I'm so sorry." I hoped the operator couldn't hear the quaver in my voice. There was a pause. "Are you sure you're all right, ma'am?" "No, I'm fine. I think I just rolled over in bed and hit a bunch of numbers on my phone," I lied. "I'm not going to get in trouble for this, am I? I mean, I'm still a teenager." The grip on my arm loosened, and I backed out the rusted door. The MVSH member let me go, but stayed within arm's reach, ready to pounce if I broke our unspoken deal. "Not this time, ma'am, but you need to be more careful in the future." Click. The MVSH member's black eyes glared at me expressionlessly. I continued backing away, holding the glowing screen out in front of me like a magic amulet. I was ready to hit redial if he tried anything, and we both knew it. "I have a sister in there," I began. "If you could tell her." Another MVSH member came running out of the shadows, carrying that awful pole in his hands. I turned to run and felt the whoosh of the pole as it swept over my head and slammed into my wrist. Pain exploded in my hand. Raquel's phone shattered on the asphalt. I expected to hear chasing footsteps behind me, but instead, the steel-shuttered door slammed shut. It was like the pair had never been there at all. Deep within the guts of that abandoned factory, the concert was still going on, its unsuspecting audience being pressed tighter and tighter until... what? until they were all crushed alive while the band played on above. I didn't want to think about it because somewhere in that crowd was my sister. My wet clothes stuck to my skin, reeking of chicken broth and reminding me of what was happening back there. I had to get help, but finding my way through the winding alleys between the warehouses was taking forever. And even once I got back to the road, there was no one passing through this derelict district so late at night. Caught somewhere between exhaustion and panic, I waved my arms at anyone that passed by. The first car didn't stop. Neither did the second. After what felt like hours, a grizzled 50-something in a pickup truck pulled off the road, but he kept his hand on a glove box pistol, just in case. He didn't have a cell phone, but he would take me as far as a gas station where I could make a call. By the time my garbled story got out and the police closed in on the factory, it was almost dawn. MVSH, the two white semi-trucks, and their audience had vanished. With so many sudden disappearances, I had imagined that the case would make national news. But none of the journalists my family contacted were interested. After a while, I began to see their point. A traveling band that crushes its audience into goo? Not even the weirdest tabloids would consider running a story like that. The police said nothing about my sister's disappearance, only reassuring us that the investigation was ongoing. I started doing some digging of my own, and what I found was bizarre. Despite being such a supposedly phenomenal band, there was almost no information about MVSH online. What little there was got taken down almost as soon as it appeared, but even so, it was clear that I wasn't the only one who had lost a loved one to their deadly concerts. Someone on an anonymous forum claimed to have seen MVSH carrying plastic sacks of pink sludge into their white semi-trucks after one of their shows. Someone else said she found a heap of ripped, discarded clothing in the woods near where MVSH had performed. 2 days into my search, I began to receive bizarre, threatening messages. They were nothing but a jumble of letters and numbers, but scattered inside the chaos were eerie details. The name of the drink I had ordered at the coffee shop that morning, the address of the friend whose apartment I'd visited the night before. After that came the phone calls. There was never any voice on the other end of the line, only a bunch of garbled noise and screams. It was the sound of an MVSH concert. As soon as I stopped investigating MVSH, the messages and phone calls stopped. Did I want to know what had really happened to my sister? Sure, but not enough to die for it. I learned to live with the past. I went back to school, eventually getting a doctorate in literature and taking a teaching position at a forgettable college in the Southeast. Bands don't even come through this state while they're on tour, much less this unimportant town. And yet 2 days ago, the music professor approached me in the cafeteria with an excited sparkle in his eye. A super experimental band was coming to town, he explained. One so exclusive that didn't even charge tickets for entry. All we had to do was bring a few spice packets, and they would put on a show that would change our lives forever. The nightmare may be over for them, but for others, it was only getting started. The Transformation of Professor Ismay, Part 1. I've been fascinated with insects for as long as I can remember. When I was a child, I used to collect caterpillars from my yard and keep them in a fish tank in my bedroom. I'd feed them until they grew fat, and when they formed their cocoons, I would sketch them as I eagerly awaited their transformation into butterflies and moths. Once upon a time, this process would absolutely enthrall me. How something so small and meager could become something so beautiful was, to me at least, one of nature's greatest magic tricks. But now, as I write this from my hospital bed, I have come to understand why God was so selective when deciding which of his creations would perform this great miracle. In the wrong form, that miracle was nothing short of a blight, a curse, a damnation, and something that I, ashamedly engaged with, encouraged, and observed. Allow me to explain. For the sake of my anonymity, I'll refer to myself as John Smith. Also, you should assume that any other name I mention is a pseudonym. It's just safer that way. I live in the northwest of England. I won't say exactly where for your own safety, because I know a few of you will go looking after what I tell you, but know that it is a picturesque area of outstanding natural beauty that sees many tourists from all over the country all year round. There are mountains aplenty, lakes and rivers, vast swathes of woodland, and quaint little towns and villages nestled between the many great wrinkles of the land. Amongst these many towns and villages, you will find large manor houses here and there. They mostly belong to wealthy families who enjoy the peaceful bliss of nature, safely hidden away from the hustle and bustle of larger cities found further south. After a brief stint in the forces, where I worked as a chef, I decided to focus my efforts towards a career in catering. Those wealthy families? They don't cook for themselves, or rather they won't. In a city, they would find an abundance of restaurants of nearly every variety that would bend over backwards for the contents of their wallets. In a village, unless they had no issues with eating at the same pub restaurant every night, they would have to cook their own food, which they didn't do. It was somehow beneath them. That's where I came in. I would go from house to house, cooking for and catering to those wealthy families for months at a time. Nearly every day, for almost 5 years after I left the army, things were going well. I made a bit of a reputation for myself, and business was consistent. Then, for no reason whatsoever, the work began to dry up. Families that were previously all too keen to have me serve them suddenly stopped calling. I called around, made apologies, though I was unsure what for, and even offered my services at a lower rate, but nothing came through. Nobody wanted me anymore. It was as if I had suddenly become a nuisance to these people. More on that later. I still don't understand it. I was known well enough. My services were always well received, and I'd never had any complaints. I thought for sure it was just a dry spell, that I would see the other side of it, but I was wrong. It was becoming apparent that working as a rent-a-chef was suddenly not a viable option anymore, so I considered a different line of work. I searched job listings online for anything within 10 miles or so. I'd work construction, sweep streets, anything at all, just to get some cash flowing. God knows I needed the money. My applications were ignored. Time and time again I was denied interviews and callbacks. I had started to believe that I was cursed. At that point, I'd gone almost 3 months without any source of income. My savings were nearly spent. I'd fallen behind on my utility bills, and I hadn't been able to pay my rent for the previous month. My landlord wasn't known for his charitable attitude, and I had run out of time. I wouldn't last another month. I couldn't. I'd almost given up hope that I would work again. Then I received a letter in the mail one Monday morning. It read, "Dear Mr. Smith, you do not know me, but I know you. I know that you are a chef and that you are looking for work. If you would lend my family your services, I will gladly pay you thrice your usual fees. All I would ask is that you reply promptly and that you speak of this to no one. Come before nightfall. The choice is yours. Make it quickly." On the back of the letter was an address for a manor house, one I had never heard of before. It wasn't too far, only around 9 miles away, though it was off the beaten track a little bit. If I knew before I started what I know now, I would have stuck with my original plan and looked for work elsewhere. But 3 times my usual fee? At a time when I needed money the most? There was no way I was going to turn it down. God, I wish I had. Day 1. It took 2 buses to get there. I arrived at the house later that same Monday, somewhere around 4. I found the house hiding in the woods, down a graveled road that led away from the main village road, not far from the bus stop. It was a large building, nestled in the trees by a lake. With its towers, terraces, and black slate roofs, it was like something from the Addams Family, the kind of place that screams generational wealth. I knocked on the heavy wooden door and waited. Soon enough, a little old lady answered the door. She was small, hunched over, and softly spoken. Her wrinkled eyes peeked over her dainty golden glasses that sat perched on the ridge of her nose. She shivered in the breeze. In a way, she reminded me of my grandmother. "Sorry to disturb you. I've come about a job," I said. "Very good, Mr. Smith. Come in," she replied. And as simple as that, I was through the door. The old lady asked me to wait, and she shuffled off into another room at the rear of the large foyer I found myself in. The house was grand, to say the least. I've never seen so much polished wood and such expensive furnishings, and I've seen the inside of more than a few mansions, let me tell you. After a minute or so, the old lady returned. Alongside her walked another woman, though she was much younger. I'd soon learn that she was the one who'd written to me. "Mr. Smith?" the younger woman said. I smiled and shook her hand, told her it was a pleasure to meet her. "My name is Elizabeth Ismay." She said, "I'd like to get right to it if it's all the same to you." "Not a problem," I said. She led me through the foyer and into the kitchen at the rear of the house. Now, when I say kitchen, I don't mean that it was one stove, a fridge, a microwave, and some countertops. This was the kitchen to rival all kitchens. Imagine any appliance, and it was there, except the Ismay's was better. Imagine the biggest kitchen you've ever seen, and then double it again. I'd seen smaller kitchens in Michelin star restaurants in London. Elizabeth allowed me to take in my surroundings, and after I'd picked my jaw up from the floor, she spoke again. "This is where you will work, Mr. Smith. Monday to Saturday, 10 till 7 every day. You have free reign over the kitchen and all its appliances. The menu is already decided, and the food will be supplied. All you need to do is prepare it, cook it, and serve it." I didn't want to work that much, but I didn't want to be homeless and jobless either. "Okay," I managed. "Can I see the menu?" She motioned with her hand towards one of the counters where a stack of laminated A4 sheets of paper sat. In all honesty, I thought at that moment that it was some kind of joke. Each sheet was filled from top to bottom with meat-only dishes, and I genuinely mean meat only. Not one vegetable, not a drop of sauce or gravy, no side dishes or sweets or drinks or anything. Just meat, meat, and more meat, all the way down. I glanced up at Elizabeth as she stood silently in the doorway. She was expressionless and still. This was no joke. "Who am I cooking for?" I asked. She paused a moment before simply saying, "My father." "Your father?" She nodded. "There will be rules, Mr. Smith," she said, beckoning me to follow her. I left the menus where I found them and stepped after her. It was at this moment I should have left. I was already a little freaked out, and you didn't need to be a chef to understand why this whole meat-only menu was bizarre. But again, the money was on my mind. She took me into the foyer, and we stood beneath a large portrait painting of an elderly man in a large leather chair. On a polished brass plaque at its base, it read, "Professor Bernard Ismay." "My father," she said, pointing. "He was the foremost authority of entomology in his prime. He studied at Oxford and eventually taught there." I nodded as I glanced up at him. He looked exactly what you would imagine an elderly multimillionaire looked like. Stern-faced with a grimace of self-superiority. "I really must insist on your discretion, Mr. Smith. Can I rely on you to be discreet?" Elizabeth asked. I nodded again. "My father is unwell, you see," she continued. "For quite some time now, he has been undergoing something of a change." "What do you mean?" I asked. She glanced up at the portrait and cleared her throat a little. "Over time, it seems that he has begun to hate the taste of, well, ordinary food. He won't stand for vegetables or fruits, will not even consider rice or grains. He desires only meat. As of late, he has become difficult to live with." "Why?" I asked. "We're not sure," she said. "No one can understand why. He's seen doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists. I have given up wondering if I'm being completely honest. It's better to accept the situation for what it is, we've found." "What situation? What's going on?" I asked. "Can I trust you, Mr. Smith?" "Yes," I said. "Then give me your phone," she said, holding out her hand. "Why?" "Does your phone have a camera?" she asked. I nodded. "Then please," she said, holding out her hand. I hesitated at first, but eventually handed it to her. I knew she wasn't going to rob me. I needed only to look around to understand that she had no interest in a phone worth less than the shoes she wore. And besides, curiosity had taken hold. "Follow me," she said, "and please be quiet. Do not speak unless I say so." We climbed the stairs together. As I followed behind her, I noticed the little old lady was staring at me from the corner of a doorway behind us. She looked concerned, truth be told, like a child awaiting punishment from an angry parent in another room. The walls of the stairwell were covered in framed pictures of Professor Ismay as a younger man. He was often in the presence of other academics, standing outside of what I assume was his university. In others, he was in forests and jungles, standing with various native people, or holding some sort of insect for the camera to see. A man after my own heart, it would seem, though his circumstances were so far beyond anything I'd ever known. At the top of the stairs was a large wooden panel door with metal hinges that extended across the full width of its face. It was bolted shut at the top and bottom with thick iron bolts, and there was a strange smell coming from within. Elizabeth motioned for me to be quiet. There was a small table to our left with a drawer. Beside that was a metal food trolley on wheels that was covered in scratch marks, as though a pack of dogs had fought across it for scraps. Elizabeth opened the table drawer, pulled out a can of silicone spray lubricant that you might find in an engineer's toolbox, and doused each of the 3 hinges with it before slowly unbolting the door. Movies would have you believe that wooden doors creak when they open, and that it is somehow creepier for doing so. But believe me when I tell you, when a large wooden door the size of a dining table opens in complete silence to a near pitch-black room, there isn't much else scarier in this world. I glanced at Elizabeth and nearly asked her right then and there, what the hell was this all about? But I could see there was a fear in her eyes, a deep, almost primal fear of the unknown, like that of a child hiding from monsters beneath their bed. I stayed silent and simply glanced inside as she did. As my eyes adjusted, I could faintly make out the shape of a bed at the rear of the room. The curtains were drawn and there was no source of light whatsoever. No lamps, no candles, nothing. There was a cold breeze that rolled out towards us, gripping my ankles and running up my back like the caress of a lover. I found that I was breathing heavier, and my fingers were twitching. The worst part was the smell. As a chef, you get used to the smell of rotten food from time to time. But this was something else. It almost made me cough as it struck me in the back of my throat. I tried to stifle it, but I couldn't. As a small noise escaped my throat, I noticed some movement on the bed. There was a strange metallic clink, a slight groan, and in the dark of the room, I saw 2 minuscule white dots appear, reflecting the light from behind us. What I can only assume were eyes observed me in the doorway before the sound of shuffling began. Before I could do anything else, Elizabeth pulled the door shut and bolted it. Inside, there began a slow thudding sound that grew louder and louder, as though someone was walking our way with slow, labored footsteps. A drag and a thump. A drag and a thump. "Is there something wrong with your father?" I asked. "Let's go, quickly," Elizabeth said. She handed me my phone back as we descended the stairs. I had no idea what the hell I'd just seen in there, and I had no intention of finding out. Elizabeth saw me to the door, and as I began my polite but firm refusal to accept the job she offered to pay me 5 times my normal fee. 3 meals a day, she said, Monday to Saturday. Simply wheel the food through the door on the trolley, close the door, and wait for my father to finish eating before you retrieve the trolley again. "Why are you offering me this job?" I asked. "You wrote me a letter saying you know me, but how? And what is wrong with your father?" I was irate and made no attempt to hide it. "Mr. Smith, me and my family have been searching for someone like you for a long time. We simply cannot provide the service for my father that I know you are capable of. And your name came my way from a website that matches employers with potential employees. Are you looking for work or not?" "What is wrong with that man up there?" I asked again. "That man up there is my father," she said sternly. "To you, he is Professor Ismay. As I said before, he is very ill, and I did not want us to disturb him. If you're concerned about contagion, then do not be. You will be perfectly safe as long as you follow the rules. Now, if it's all the same to you, I would have your answer. Will you cook for my father, or do you have other prospects?" I thought about it for a moment. What else could I do? Day 2. I started the next day. After a good night's rest, I was not as unsettled as I had been the day before, though I was not completely comfortable with the situation either. I thought about Professor Ismay on the journey to the house. I thought about the fear in Elizabeth's eyes as we stood in his bedroom doorway. Mostly, I thought about the money. I had a tendency to overthink things, and it usually sent my anxiety through the roof. Just cook and serve, is what I told myself. Just cook and serve. I just needed to hold on for something else, something normal. Then I would leave and be okay. When I arrived, it was as she had promised. The kitchen fridges were stocked with meats of all varieties, some local, some more exotic, beef, venison, wild boar, kangaroo. There were even a couple of packs of puffin breast meat, shipped straight from Iceland earlier that week. Elizabeth insisted that my phone be placed in a locker in the corner of the room for the whole day. She said she didn't want anything to potentially disturb her father. I wasn't glued to it or anything, so I didn't mind. I did notice that there was a security camera in the top corner of the room. They must have had issues in the past with other chefs, but I didn't ask. I'm pretty sure that Elizabeth and the little old lady, who it turns out is called Agnes, are the only people who live in that big house, besides Professor Ismay, of course. So far, I haven't seen anyone else there at all. I started at 10, and by 12, I had finished the first section of the first menu. Fried beefsteaks, blue rare, roasted chicken breasts, and a chunky pork joint. The menu came with instructions on how to serve the meal too. These were arguably more strange than the food itself. They read, "The prepared meats will be placed together in the large round metal bowl provided. No utensils or napkins are required, and no seasonings of any kind are to accompany the food. The bowl is then to be placed in the center of the metal trolley. After lubricating the door hinges with the silicone spray, the door may be unbolted and opened carefully. The trolley is wheeled no more than 10 feet into the room, where the server will then ring a small handheld bell. The server will then leave promptly, taking the bell and locking the door shut behind them. The server will then return to the kitchen for at least an hour and wait for the professor to finish eating. Do not disturb the professor. Do not speak to the professor. Do not return before 1 hour. No deviations from the rules under any circumstances." Never before have I had to deal with anything like this. It was absurd, but undeniably intriguing. What I couldn't understand was, well, it was a lot of food. Easily an 8-person meal, and I was supposed to believe that one sick old man was going to eat it all? And it was only the first of 3 meals that day. I fully expected to be throwing away quite a lot of food. I was wrong. I prepared the meats and filled the bowl, then set about carrying it upstairs to the waiting trolley by Professor Ismay's door. On the trolley was the bell. About the size of a cola can, it was a dull silver with a black wooden handle. I placed the bowl on the trolley and pushed it to the door. From the little table drawer, I retrieved the silicone spray, and imitating what I'd seen the day before, I lubricated the hinges before unbolting the door and pushing it open slowly. The same cold breeze from the day before took hold of me as the smell entered my nose. It was foul, like rot and human filth. Once again, I couldn't see anything inside. It was nearly pitch black. I wheeled the trolley into the room about 10 feet, or what I thought was 10 feet, then gave the bell a quick shake. Ironically, its jingle was quite jolly. Curiosity got the better of me. I walked backwards towards the door, keeping my eyes fixed forward into that dark abyss. As expected, there was movement in the dark. Slowly, as if burdened by the weight of his own body, the professor slunk from his bed. His movement sounded wet and heavy. The stench worsened tenfold, as though the professor's movement disturbed something deep within that dark room, unleashing a greater torrent of whatever filth befouled the air. I saw only the faint glow of his eyes as he shuffled my way before I closed the door and bolted it quickly. Inside, as I pressed my ear to the door, I could hear a clicking sound, like a Geiger counter, but larger and with a deeper sound. I could hear the faint wet smacking of lips and teeth, and the horrid gurgling rumble of the professor's eating. As I turned, I jumped. Elizabeth stood at the top of the stairs. She motioned angrily for me to follow her, and I did. I expected to be chastised in some way. I had broken the rules after all, and on my first day too. Instead, she gently asked me to remember the rules and set me back into the kitchen. I waited in there for an hour and 10 minutes. I'd cleaned everything, prepared as much as I could for the second meal, and after that was done, I was just standing there, biding my time. I glanced out of the rear window at the garden. They had rows upon rows of wildflowers. At the back of the garden were around a dozen wooden hives for honeybees. I could see them faintly, black dots upon the breeze here and there, gathering their nectar. They had it easy. Upstairs, I could hear thumping, dragging and thumping and the clinking of metal. I turned, and in the doorway to the kitchen was Agnes, glancing over her little glasses at me with a shy smile. "The master's finished, my love," she said. I checked my watch and gave her a slight nod and a smile and made my way towards the stairway. Before I could pass Agnes, she placed her hand on my arm and stopped me. I noticed her hand was wrapped in bandages. I don't remember if it had been the day before. We locked eyes, and she leaned in to whisper, "Be careful." I didn't know what to say, other than, "Okay." I climbed the stairs, and Agnes watched from the doorway to the kitchen until I was out of her sight. I hadn't seen Elizabeth since our earlier encounter, and when I reached the professor's door, I felt quite alone. I pressed my ear to the door. I couldn't hear anything inside. I lubricated the hinges once more and unbolted the door. I held on to that handle with all my strength. I was fully prepared to pull it shut as fast as I could. As the door opened slowly and the cold caressed my face, I peered into that foul-smelling blackness. I allowed the door to open only a foot or so, just until the trolley was visible. It was as I had left it, as well as the bowl on top. Only they appeared to be wet. The bowl was empty, so I figured the professor had made quite a considerable mess when he ate. I at least knew where the smell was coming from now. Whatever mental illness this once great academic was suffering from was beyond belief. And it was just now dawning on me how depressing it must have been for his family to see him that way. I opened the door wider, and as my eyes began to adjust to the darkness within, I saw his bed at the rear of the room. There was a large dark patch in the middle. It must have been him. All I could hear was the sound of wet, labored mouth breathing and the faint thump of my own heartbeat. I reached in slowly, grasped the trolley, and pulled it towards me. The handle was wet, but I wanted out of that room, so I didn't care. I stepped back into the hallway, pulled the door shut, and bolted it. I breathed a sigh of relief before I looked down and nearly vomited in disgust. The trolley was indeed wet, but in the light of the hallway, I could see that it wasn't from the food. It was a thick, clear mucus. Day 3. It took a lot for me to return the next day. After the mucus on the trolley, I nearly ran right out of there. Elizabeth caught me at the bottom of the stairs, told me that I did everything adequately. She reassured me that the job would be worth my while, and that any future incidents involving mucus would lead me to be compensated financially. So I agreed to continue. The second and third meals were much like the first, except I brought some latex gloves with me when I was to retrieve the trolley. Puffin breast and turkey crowns, sausages, and deshelled oysters. By all accounts, it was disgusting to look at. Frankly, I still can't believe the professor was able to eat it all. I figured that most of it was going to waste. As I stepped off the bus on Tuesday morning, Agnes was waiting by the door for me. She greeted me with a smile and welcomed me in. Elizabeth was nowhere to be seen. I placed my phone inside the locker and started to prep the kitchen. Threw things into ovens, oiled some pans, etc. The first meal of the day was 3 whole chickens, an entire pork loin, and half a kilo of pickled cockles. For anyone who doesn't know what cockles are, they're like clams the size of your thumbnail. They're perfectly fine in small quantities, but a half kilo absolutely stinks out the whole kitchen, no matter what you do with them. Whoever is cleaning up after the professor, heaven help them. I carried the bowl up to the trolley, which had been cleaned before I arrived that morning, and tried not to gag at the sight of the meats sloppily rolling around inside it. I placed the bowl on top of the trolley and pushed it into position. I unbolted the door, and just like I had the day before, pushed it open slowly, making sure my hand was on the handle at all times. Quietly, the door glided into that horrid darkness. I could see the dark shape on the bed again, and hear the wet, labored breathing of the professor within. Suddenly, the door groaned as it came to the end of its swing. I froze. I had forgotten to lubricate the hinges. I didn't know what to do. I saw the professor glance towards me. He moved across the bed, only this time, instead of a slow, cumbersome slide, he almost sprang to his feet. My heart went cold as our eyes met from across the room. 2 beads of white in the darkness were fixed on me, menacingly. I heard the clicking sound from the day before. It was coming from him. I pushed the trolley inside quickly as he made his approach towards me. I heard the clinking of metal mixed with the drag thump of his steps, the low groan and the clicking and the pounding of my heart, a symphony of horror that I would give anything not to hear. I staggered backwards awkwardly, too afraid to move any quicker. and suddenly felt a tightness in my chest as I was pulled backwards by the collar of my shirt. It was Agnes. She must have been watching me from the stairs and grabbed me just in time, but not before I caught my first glimpse of the professor in the light of the hallway. I saw only his leg as he stepped into the light, but it was enough to sicken me to my core. His skin was gray and hideously textured like the skin of a toad, with lumps and boils that glistened with an unknown moisture that seemed to cling to him like a film. I gasped as Agnes closed the door and drove the bolts home with a thud. As we stood outside of his room, I could hear the ravenous old man devouring that bowl of meat with an anger I hadn't heard before. He grunted and snarled as he went, like an animal territorial over its kill. Wet smacking sounds and the crunching of bones emanated from within that dark putrid room as Agnes and I stood together in silence. I glanced down at her, still breathing heavily and not knowing what to say. She had tears in her eyes as she looked at me. "He was a great man once," she said, and then she walked away. I took a walk outside. I needed some air. I checked my phone and my emails, but there was no response to any of the applications I had sent out the night before. I decided to take a longer break than I would normally, just so I could apply for as many jobs as possible. I expanded my search to 50 miles. I didn't care anymore. It had only been a few days, but it was enough. The whole situation with the professor was absolutely horrid. He needed help. He did not need me. I sent a few emails over the course of about 15 minutes and then took a short walk amongst the trees. The air smelled of pine needles and the lake. I saw a few squirrels and some birds, and after a while, I was feeling a little better. I decided to head back to the house, and I did so begrudgingly, dawdling as I went. I empathized with the professor's family. Mostly Agnes, if I'm being honest. She was clearly shaken by the whole situation, and wasn't in any position to do anything about it. As I approached the house, I glanced upwards towards what I guessed would be the professor's room. It was quite high up, despite being on the first floor. The only room with the curtains fully drawn. Even from the outside, it was clear that the windows were absolutely filthy. As though a fire had been lit within the room, the glass was blackened and smeared with grime. I didn't want to think of what it might be. The thought would likely make me puke. As I was staring at the window, I noticed one of the curtains was moving. It swayed a little, then became still. Suddenly, a hand appeared on the glass, black and wet in the grime. Then another beside it. I couldn't really see, but somehow I knew the professor was staring at me at that moment. Peeking through the filth with both hands pressed to the window, much in the way a child does. Then the curtain twitched again, and the hands disappeared back into the dark. I went back inside and cleaned the kitchen. There was still no sign of Elizabeth, and Agnes was pottering around in one of the sitting rooms. Above me, I could hear the drag thump of Professor Ismay's steps, and occasionally a loud bang, almost as though he was jumping around up there. After a while, it stopped. The next meal was 10 lobster tails, 2 pounds of beef mince, a whole duck, and escargot. As I left at the end of the day, I glanced back up towards the professor's window. I wondered how he had come to be this way, and how had it began. What could topple a man from the heights of intellectual achievement down to this monstrous existence? It was then, as I was taking one last look at his window, I realized something. The 2 handprints had the thumb on the same side. Day 4. Before I had left my house that morning, I received a text from Elizabeth. It read, "Good morning. No need to come in today. I'm afraid my father is unwell. You will still be paid, so don't worry. Return to work tomorrow as normal. Thank you." I really did not mind at all. I would have the perfect opportunity to head into the village and try to find another job. I'd take all day doing it too if I had to. I took the bus and a couple of CVs with me, handing them out here and there. To my surprise, any of the pubs or small cafes I visited seemed to react quite negatively towards me. Some refused my CV altogether. I didn't understand. That was until I ran into a friend of mine, or at least a former friend of mine. I was just exiting a newsagent when I ran into him, a man called Lionel. "Long time no see," I said. "Yeah," he said flatly. "Excuse me." He tried to get by me, his face almost expressionless, as if he had no time for me at all. "Lionel?" I said, tapping his arm. "What?" he snapped back. "You all right?" "I'm fine, mate. You all right?" There was a hint of anger in his voice this time. Something was going on. "Lionel, are you mad at me or something?" I asked. "Are you taking the piss?" Or heck, he fired back. A few people on the street were staring now. Lionel looked absolutely livid about something. "What's going on, mate?" I asked. "What's going on?" he snapped. "You are taking the piss. Fuck off, you disgusting prick." And with that, he went inside. I had known Lionel for about 2 years at that point. He was a chef too, so we knew each other through work. I waited for him outside the newsagent while he shopped inside. Across the street was a small coffee house. Inside, I could see people pointing at me, talking between themselves. The barista was scowling at me. As Lionel stepped back into the street, he groaned when he saw me waiting. "Lionel," I said loudly. He had begun to walk away at speed, but I kept pace with him. "Lionel, what the fuck is going on?" Suddenly he spun around. There was a fire in his eyes. I'd never seen him like this before. He looked me up and down as though he was observing something alien and disgusting to him. Then he spat at my feet. "Kids," he yelled. "Kids? What are you talking?" He punched me in the face and I staggered backwards. My nose was bleeding, and when I looked up, he was walking away. I never saw him again after that. I felt unwell the rest of the day. There was a metallic taste in the back of my mouth, and I had a headache. I popped into a small supermarket that I knew had a deli sandwich bar in the back. I had one last CV, so I figured I'd try there too. The manager took one look at me and shook his head. "Why?" I asked bluntly. "Are you joking?" he replied. I looked behind me as I heard some commotion and could see someone pointing a security guard in my direction. It was as though the whole world had turned against me, and I didn't know why. "Why won't you accept my CV?" I asked loudly. "I've got kids of my own, you know. Lots of folk in here do. Those pictures have been going around, you know. What chance did you think you have?" I heard the approach of footsteps, boots squeaking on the tile floor. What have I done? Why won't anyone hire me? I cried. A hand grasped my shoulder, and a deep voice commanded me to leave with him. As I was pulled away, the man behind the bar shook his head and turned away. The security guard, who was not gentle when he pushed me outside, stood in the doorway, blocking me from re-entering. I could feel tears forming and a lump in the back of my throat as I headed towards the bus station. I reached the stop and it began to rain. Beside me, a bunch of teenagers came to stand beneath the shelter to escape the weather, and when they noticed me, they began to chatter amongst themselves, laughing and whispering. I heard one of them say, "That's him." Another one called me a pedophile. I walked home in the rain, hiding my face beneath the hood of my coat. I'll post the rest tomorrow. Just thinking about that day makes me feel unwell. While one door closes, another opens, revealing an even darker secret. It mimics the visage of others because it can't remember its own arm. I slapped my alarm as quickly and quietly as I could. While holding my hand over the alarm, I slowly turned to see if I had woken my wife. Jane always managed to look pretty, even when she was sleeping. Well, not really, but she looked pretty to me. I walked to the bedroom door on my way to the kitchen, making sure to avoid the creaky, aged planks that made up my bedroom floor. I could practically step around them with my eyes closed. Jane has always loved the taste of fresh game. I could never understand what she liked about it, but I loved hunting, so it was a nice balance. I tried preparing the pots and plates as quietly as I could. But you know, they're pots and plates. I told myself she couldn't hear anything I was doing, and the surprise wouldn't be ruined, but I'm certain I heard her trying to race back up the stairs quietly to spare my feelings. After leaving the kitchen ready for the meal I would prepare later, I grabbed my beautiful bolt-action CZ rifle and left out the front door. The outside world greeted me with a single tone that mirrored itself as far east as west. The blinding white frost of the cold winter morning created the illusion of distance at infinity, while simultaneously appearing completely flat and right in your face. A gentle breeze made sure my eyes never opened further than a squint. I whistled at my lazy mutt, and he poked his head out of his luxurious doghouse. I lowered my fist to Bartleby, and he used my knuckles to give himself a nice shiatsu head massage. I tucked my hand back into my pockets after the cold strips what little heat I had left. Bartleby bites at my hand, annoyed that I put it away. I led him to the passenger side of my truck. opened the door for him, and he hopped in, closing the door behind him with his jaws on the rag I wrapped around the handle on the inside. I walked over to the driver's side, and just before I ducked into the seat, I looked up to see her smiling at me from the second-floor window. When I saw her, she flinched away, but quickly came back when she realized I had already seen her. She gives me a bashful smile and wave, and I shake my head chuckling while waving back at her. I start the truck and regret not getting the heater fixed. Even on high, it's only barely enough to allow me one hand on the wheel while I warm up the other. At least she's a reliable rig. We cut through the fresh snow with ease on the main road, heading towards a nice hunting spot that I frequently visit. Bartleby had already buried himself in his smelly blanket and refused to come out. I pat him over the blanket. "Come on, boy. Haven't you slept enough?" He stubbornly gives me a soft woof. I reach into the glove box and pull out a package of dried venison. I lay a piece next to his snout, and he briefly pokes his nose out to sniff and lick up the treat. I rub his head and continue down the road until I reach my right turn. After arriving, Bartleby and I left the truck and headed towards the tree line. Bartleby immediately finds a tree to mark his territory at, and as I wait for him, I begin to load up my rifle one round at a time. The forest is oddly quiet until I hear faint footsteps in the distance. I squint my eyes to try and see what's causing the noise, and I see something coming towards us from in the woods. I used my scope to get a better look at the animal and saw that it was a wolf sprinting in my direction. I looked further up and saw an enormous pack of snarling wolves following closely behind the first. My eyes widened as an electric wave of shock sprang from my heart to all of my fingers. Despite the biting cold, I broke out into a sweat. I hadn't even realized I dropped my bullets. After they lightly landed on the ground, I had already turned around to run for the truck, stopping when I didn't see Bartleby following. I must have stopped too quickly because my feet easily lost the ground and I found it with my hands and nearly my face. I got up as quickly as possible, ignoring my stinging hands. I ran back to Bartleby with the stampede of menacing black fur and white, hungry teeth in the background, growing in size with each passing moment. You don't realize how large a wolf really is until you see one with your own eyes. As soon as I could reach him, I grabbed his collar and yanked. He got the message and began following. We weren't far from the truck, but the wolves also weren't far from us. Their paws were dreadfully audible now, and as I ran, I couldn't tell if the panting directly behind me was my own dog or a wild wolf. I must have been panicking too much because after I reached the truck, I ended up on my ass again. "Damn it!" I exclaimed as I missed the handle by mere inches. I looked up and it was too late. There was no time to make it back in the truck. Bartleby stood over me like a lion. He braced for the gnashing jaws of fierce wolves, but the impact never hit. The wolves ran over Bartleby and I as if we weren't even there. They completely ignored us and continued running as a pack, as if they were caught up in a blazing forest fire and had made a temporary alliance with all life in the forest to just escape. I watched them cross the main road I had turned on. Their large frames shrunk to nothing in the vast empty canvas that blurred the lines between heaven and earth. The only discernible point of reference was the sun, faded behind clouds with no depth or shadow. I sat there in silence for a moment, trying to calm my breath. Maybe the trees absorbed the wind. Maybe the snow muted the ambience. But after the storm of wolves passed by, the silence of the forest was unnerving. Still sitting on the ground, I laughed to myself in terror as Bartleby licked my face, trying to comfort me. I gave him my knuckles, and he scratched his head with them. Returning to where I dropped the bullets, I noticed that the divide between the forest and the rest of the world suddenly seemed greater. I stood before the border of two worlds, and I willingly stepped into one where I didn't belong. Walking through the forest, I looked up directly at the sun and felt no pain due to the clouds evenly distributing its light everywhere. Still morning, nearing noon. Bartleby found a scent, and I followed him. Eventually, the scent became a small trail of blood. That wasn't too unusual, but what I saw in the distance was. I jogged ahead of Bartleby because he was still just focused on the trail in front of him. I saw something in the trees. My gaze grew more intense with every step, as a clearer picture revealed itself to be another wolf hanging upright on a tree branch, with its innards on display like some sick, mad scientist dissection experiment. Its skin was stretched out and pinned to the tree branches as if someone were leaving an animal's skin out to dry in the sun. The corpse was still purging its scarlet fluids onto the massive blotch of foul, black-dyed snow below. My brow furrowed, and my face turned to a scowl of confusion and disgust. The pure white snow around the gory scene only made the colors seem more vibrant and clear. What the hell could have done this? Bartleby backed up with his tail between his legs. I looked around some more and noticed the surrounding trees all had unrecognizable symbols roughly carved into them. I didn't know what to make of what I was seeing. It was simply strange and disturbing to say the least. Finally, we arrived at my little tree fort, hunting shack, shelter, whatever you want to call it. I built her right onto a tall, strong tree. Bartleby jumped into the box I made for him, attached to a rope leading all the way up. I climbed up first, using the ladder steps nailed right into the tree. Then I pulled the rope to bring Bartleby up with me. The shelter was a small one. Standing upright in it was impossible, and if I laid down on any side with my hands and feet stretched out, I could easily touch each side of the walls. Only one side of the wall had an entire section of wood missing to show the view of the deeper part of the forest. The other walls could only be opened with small hinged hatches, acting as windows, barely large enough to fit my head. There was a large camo tarp covering the biggest segment of the open wall to keep out the cold. We sat patiently and comfortably inside, protected from the unrelenting cold, but despite the gentle howling of the wind, the forest really was oddly quiet. I hadn't realized how clearly I could hear my blood pulsing to the beat of my heart in my head, until the silence was broken by a gentle knocking just behind my head on the wooden wall where I was sitting. Immediately my veins froze over, my heart sank as my eyes grew. I tried to ease my growing heartbeat by thinking, well, it's probably just a loose branch. I got up, hunched over, and looked at the hatch on the wall. I hesitated as I began to raise my hand towards the lock when another 3 knocks halted my movement. A weak voice from either a young boy or a lady said, "Hello," from the other side of the wall. The adrenaline came back, and I worried someone out there was freezing, in need of my help, but no, that couldn't be. How did they get up here? Have they been here for some time, before I even arrived? Are they just hanging on the tree? No, if someone was out there in need of help, they wouldn't be waiting outside a shelter. I would have found them in here when I came up. I looked at Bartleby and was surprised he hadn't started barking. He stared at the wall intensely without moving. I opened my mouth to respond to whoever was on the other side, but for some reason, my instincts were telling me to do as Bartleby was doing. Bartleby and I sat still, feeling like my heartbeat was being too loud. My body strained from being in an awkward position for too long. It felt like any small movement would mean trouble, so I ignored the static in my legs as they fell asleep from being in a crouched position for so long. The silence was broken by the sound of frozen planks cracking under the weight of something on the roof. I hadn't sealed the roof as well as the walls, so there were slits where the planks joined. Light weakly pushed through, and whoever was out there began blotting out what little rays of light made it through with their limbs. It began with one patch covered as flakes of undisturbed snow fell where pressure was being applied. Then another landed as the first moved away to a new spot. Another 2 appeared behind the first 2. Whatever was out there was taking their time crawling on all 4s. I began to question whether I had really heard a voice or if the silence of the forest had finally gotten to me. My lungs forgot how to work as I watched it continue across above us. After it reached the edge of the shelter, there was one last creak, slightly more audible than the others. The shadow disappeared from the roof and briefly returned where the tarp was hiding us from the outside world. It had jumped. There was a thud on the floor below, muffled by the snow, then rapid footsteps that quickly decreased in volume. I finally remembered to breathe again and made my way to the tarp. I lifted it and looked out. Bartleby joined me in my search, but we only saw a small patch of upturned snow that broke the wavy, frozen white ocean and footprints leading away from us. I looked around for a while longer before retreating back into the shelter. Bartleby decided to stay and watch for me. I quickly checked the hatch on the side of the wall where the knocking originated. Sticking my head out, I saw nothing unusual. I locked it again and sat back down, still processing the odd occurrence. Had I really heard a voice? A few minutes later, Bartleby began softly barking at me, trying to bring my attention back outside. "What do you see, boy?" I asked while making my way over to him. I squinted into the distance where he was looking and saw movement far away. By the color of the animal, I was fairly certain it was a deer. I grabbed my rifle and put my scope in the animal's direction. I saw a deer slightly hidden behind a tree. The shot wasn't ideal, but clear enough. For a moment, I had forgotten about all that had happened up to this point, but was quickly reminded that it wouldn't end there. After focusing my sights on the deer, I noticed it wasn't quite standing, but not laying down either. And it was lightly convulsing and momentarily twitching, causing its limp, hanging head to rock unsettlingly as if its bone was disconnected, clung together only by flesh and muscle. The deer appeared to already be damaged. Maybe a wolf got to it before, because part of its coat was hanging off of its body, and the fur was dyed red by its own blood. Not too long ago, I had just woken up, well rested and with all my strength, but this day has worn me down emotionally. My mouth hung suspended in motion to speak, but being unable to find the right words to ask, and no one was even around to hear me. No one was around to hear me. I dropped the scope and looked down at the ground in need of a break from the incomprehensible scene before me. After taking a breath, I decided the deer was sick. I'd hunt it, but only to put it out of its misery. I had no intention of taking that back home with me. I fixed the scope back on the deer, and almost as soon as I did, I jumped when the deer's neck suddenly snapped back in place. Its head turned to aim its eye at me, and it felt for a split second, like we had switched roles. Fear manifested as a shiver down my spine, amplifying the winter air around me. I hastily planted the crosshairs on the deer's chest, as if to desperately take back the role of the hunter, and pulled the trigger without focusing my shot. The banging echo of the gun cracked through the forest, bringing it to life only for a moment. In the blink of an eye, a black dot appeared on the deer's chest as the bullet ripped through its body. The deer shook mildly at the bullet's impact, but otherwise stood like a boulder. The wound didn't even bleed. With no other reaction, the deer simply turned its head and ran off, or at least, it tried to run. I must have severed some sort of nerve, because the deer moved like how my dog would walk when I would put shoes on his feet, but Bartleby looked cute doing that. But this deer was simply uncanny. After the deer was long gone, I wondered if chasing it was a good idea. I didn't even want to touch it before, but my curiosity pushed me forward. Bartleby didn't like the idea and whimpered as we first followed the footsteps of whatever was knocking on my shelter. I noticed that those footsteps were oddly humanoid. They were in the direction of the deer that I had shot, so I studied them as we went. The walk seemed longer than it should have been. I looked up at the sun. It was just past noon now. I looked around the still forest, half expecting to see more odd symbols etched into the bark. "That'd be creepy," I said out loud. Arriving where the deer had been when I shot it, I saw a gruesome scene. Despite the small hole that the blood of the bullet had made on the deer's chest, the snow here was nearly completely melted away from the nauseating amounts of blood poured onto it. There was a pile of shredded organs on the floor. Some bones littered the area, and others were still attached to the muscle. There was even a skull there, all belonging to a deer, I assume. Steam rose from the heap of warm deer guts, and I gagged after staring far too long. Questions raced through my mind. I don't know what it was that was pushing me to follow the deer I had shot, but whatever it wasn't common sense. I was stupidly desperate for answers to questions I should have never asked. At this point, snow began to dance down around me from the sky. I had to move quickly before losing the trail. Bartleby loyally but reluctantly followed behind as we walked for nearly an hour in a direction I don't think I've ever walked before. The footsteps were fading as the intensity of the falling snow increased. My vision was obscuring as the snow slowly became a mild blizzard. I saw a large dark spot in the ground ahead of me, After an hour of walking, the ground rose upwards until it became a hill where I stood. The dark spot eventually revealed itself to be the mouth of a gaping, hungry cave. I was done at that point. I didn't feel it'd be worth it, and I didn't have time to go off on a side adventure with my wife waiting at home. I was already late, so I turned to leave. But something had caught me off guard. I turned around to check if what I saw was reality. The footsteps I had been following abruptly ended. I was afraid to acknowledge I had been tricked. I looked around my surroundings, and where I stood there was a treeless patch going over and around the cave. I've heard of animals like foxes backtracking to avoid predators, but what kind of animal would use that to catch prey? I looked to Bartleby for answers, and he was focused on the trees behind us. I turned back around and followed his gaze. The blizzard was giving the distance a white tint. Bartleby began growling and barking. My hair stood on end at the thought of an unseen enemy. I wouldn't have seen it if it hadn't moved. A single hand with long, slim fingers wrapped around a tree far away, open like a flower in bloom. The tree was thick, and yet this thing had half its hand around it. I looked upwards and saw the silhouette of a head. The blizzard blurred its features on the thing, but I had seen enough. I froze. I hoped that what I was seeing was just an illusion brought on by the blur of the blizzard, but I had to make sure. Those few seconds of stillness stretched into hours. I steadied the gun on my shoulder, aiming at the now still figure. I had to know if there was something really there. Bartleby had been whimpering, and his cries increased exponentially as I aimed. Just as I fired the bullet, I felt an electric current shock my left leg. I looked down and saw Bartleby biting my leg hard, tugging at me while whimpering like I'd never heard him do before. He threw my shot off, but I caught a glimpse of the figure recoiling as a misty red cloud bursts from its shoulder. My eyes returned to the figure, and it was sprinting at me on all fours. This was no illusion. I didn't wait to find out what its face looked like, undisturbed by a hazy storm. Bartleby led the way into the cave, and I followed without protest. My footsteps' echo grew as I pushed further into darkness. Eventually, I found a boulder for Bartleby and me to take cover behind. I turned to the entrance and saw the silhouette of the figure pause there, standing on two legs. I aimed my rifle again, and it ducked down, beginning to crawl again. I could no longer see it. All I saw was the bright outside world at the end of the tunnel. I sat there with Bartleby for a couple minutes, just listening for any movement. The wind caused an almost whistle-like effect inside the cave, making it difficult to make out which sounds were real and what was in my imagination. I decided it was best to keep the rifle in a defensive position as a shield, rather than hope that I'd have time to lock on to my invisible target guided by sound alone. I thought my eyes were finally adjusting to the dark, because I had convinced myself I could see hints of the cave walls around me, and just barely the outline of a tall, long-limbed humanoid figure. It was just standing to my left, not too far away. I don't understand why it hadn't attacked yet. I slowly aimed the rifle at it from my hip. I cannot stress how slowly I moved, making sure my aim was flawless. My fingers slowly squeezed the trigger. I braced for the recoil, and a split second before, mere inches away from my left ear, I heard the same weak, "Hello?" I flinched as the bullet hit my imaginary enemy. The flash gave me a brief scope of the area. There was no cave. I was surrounded by trees covered with odd symbols. My adversary had already gotten far too close to me, biding its time, using the wind as a cover for its incremental movement in the dark. I could hear it begin to make its move, but Bartleby miraculously tackled the thing before I or it could react. A struggle began. I heard my dog snarling angrily and the same human voice that said hello, except now it was howling like the souls of the damned. I began yelling, not in fear or any emotion that I could clearly describe. My voice just flowed without my permission. The monster's cries died out, but Bartleby was showing no mercy. He continued barking, snapping his jaw and tearing at whatever that thing was. I've never heard Bartleby bark so intensely. It was as if he stopped taking breaths in between barking and continued his assault. I continued yelling as my ears began ringing. After my lungs were empty, a warm glow drew my eyes. I looked at my burning home. The flames raged on as I opened my mouth to release emotional pressure through my voice. I don't know if I even made a noise. A ringing in my ears had begun deafening my audible reality. I was shaking, even though I wasn't cold. The heat from the fire felt like it scorched the hairs from my face. My wife grabbed me by the shoulders and shook me violently. I continued yelling in her face in a delirious state. I stared at her, but I couldn't remember what her face looked like. She guided the rifle in my hands to her chest while chanting something that I couldn't hear. I kept the rifle fixed on her, not knowing what else to do. She eventually walked away to the side of the house and got down on her knees. She began working on something on the floor, but I couldn't see what it was. The ringing in my head was unbearable. I couldn't explain any of my actions if I tried, but without hesitation, I lifted the barrel of my rifle to my chin and fired a round into my head. My world flashed, and I was plunged back into the dark reality of my situation. The transition shocked the air out of my lungs, and I fell to my knees, gasping for air. When I caught my breath, I noticed Bartleby whimpering weakly. I stepped towards where I heard him. "Bart? You okay, boy?" My voice quivered. I knelt down near his body. He whimpered softly. I lowered my fist to his head with tears in my eyes. Then I felt a fleshy, furless skull. I recoiled before attempting to touch it again. I reached my hand out to confirm, and again felt a fleshy body before me. I jolted up and pulled the trigger, aiming at the spot where that thing was laying in front of me. All I heard were clicks. I reloaded the rifle in a panic and attempted the trigger again. There was one last whimper as the bullet struck it. I looked towards the entrance and called out for Bartleby. "Here, boy, where are you?" He responded with a strong bark, and I saw his silhouette appear at the end of the tunnel. I jogged to him, leaving the cave behind. Stepping outside, the world seemed darker than I remembered, way too dark. I searched for the sun where I last saw it, but it had disappeared. It was now hanging low on the other side of the sky. Evening. How long was I in that cave for? Bartleby began walking ahead. I was eager to be done with this day too. "You leaving without me?" Bartleby stopped and turned his head at me. I stopped approaching him. "What's wrong, Bart?" Bartleby stared at me, and I noticed the wound on his coat. He wasn't in good shape. A piece of his skin hung loosely around the belly area. "Oh, you're hurt." I knelt down next to Bartleby and reached for him to check on his wound when he barked violently at me and growled. I sprung back up, throwing my hands in the air. "Whoa, hey Bart, it's okay. It's me, Bart." His growl faded, and he began walking back. I watched him continue for a moment, still a little shocked that he had snapped at me. Eventually, I jogged to catch up to him. I watched him carefully as we walked and made sure to keep a distance behind him in silence. The sun was about to begin its setting phase, and we began our long walk back to the truck. I went into autopilot, watching the trees go by. We walked past my shelter in the tree, and then the corpse of the gutted wolf, until the sight of my truck in the distance returned my lucidity. My steps began to feel heavier the closer I got to my truck. My body tensed up as I put my hand on the door handle. I just stood there, holding the door long enough to allow the cold metal to hold me back. "Bartleby?" I turned to him as I spoke. I peeled my hand from the door and balled it into a fist. Lowering it down to him, I said, "Come here, boy." His eyes stared at me. He stood immobile while my fist hung in the air, waiting for reception. Eventually, he slowly walked towards me and licked my fist. I stood there, clenching my jaw. My emotions turned to liquid and pushed against my eyes. I slowly pulled my hand back and gripped my rifle tightly. I closed my eyes, forcing tears down my cheek. That provided me with brief relief from the cold, but quickly froze over, stinging my face worse than the air ever could. I slowly lowered the barrel to that thing's head, and immediately it zipped away at astonishing speed. I let out a breath of short-lived relief until it turned left onto the main road in the direction of my home. I dashed to the driver's side and hopped in and drove away recklessly. I sped down the road, disregarding the speed limit. With nothing else to do, I tried to comprehend the horrors of this day, but that only left me feeling overwhelmed. I looked to my right at the passenger seat. The sight of flattened blankets put a pulsing pressure behind my eyes. I lifted them, hoping a stubborn mute would stick his nose out to greet me. My chest ached, but my body didn't allow me to shed any more tears. I couldn't even moan in pain, only release bursts of pathetic, gasping whimpers. Ignoring the roads, I shifted off onto where the grass lay under the snow when I saw my home in the distance. I glided towards my driveway as my car shook and bounced violently, and I nearly crashed had there not been a pile of snow to slow me down. I threw the door open, and as I stood out in the cold of the growing dark, I saw my wife standing in the bedroom window, embraced in darkness. She had one hand raised, waving at me. My muscles went limp, and I shook as the strength of my will bled from my very being. I calmly walked up the steps of my porch and pushed open the door that had already been left half open. It was just as cold inside as it was out. I shut and locked the door behind me and made my way up the steps, making sure to hit every creaky floorboard until I reached my bedroom door. My hands rattled violently as I revealed more of the room while pushing the door open. The thing wearing my wife's skin waited for me to see it, adjusting the stolen skin as it slid over its skull like a cheap mask. Gripping the rifle in my shaky hands, I began to raise it to my chin. That's when it jumped towards me, inserting its fingers into my right side like it was warm butter. I don't remember falling, but I sat there against the wall looking at my exposed rib and heaving lung. Somehow, I never lost my grip on the rifle. When I looked up at the thing, it had been momentarily blinded, as the stolen skin shifted around its eyes in the commotion. I somehow found the strength to get up on my feet with a horrible gurgled grunt in my throat. I stumbled down the hallway to the hatch, leading up to my attic. I struggled to reach it with half of my torso muscles gone. Eventually, I brought the ladder down and climbed. I turned around and the thing was still desperately trying to readjust my wife's face onto its own, like its existence depended on having an identity, even if it wasn't its own. I could see its bones shift, like they were each their own separate entity. I continued up and locked the hatch when I was in the attic. I stood leaning on the slanted ceiling around me with my rifle aimed at the hatch. It banged on the hatch, each strike fully intending to pulverize the barrier. When it inevitably came up, I fired a round into its chest and confirmed my suspicion that a single round wouldn't do much, especially in my limited time. I finally got a good look at this demonic being. It seemed to have given up on my wife's face and showed what it was really made of. Its facial features writhed, desperately changing shape, as if it were waiting for an input. Same went for the rest of its body, except for the parts where the stolen flesh hadn't fallen off. I fired again, this time aiming at the water heater behind the thing. It hissed moments before the bright flash sent me against the wall. I felt the burn of heat and cold simultaneously. The blaze burned the hairs off my face, and the cold behind me made them stand on end. I was weightless for the few moments I spent falling. I don't remember hitting the ground, but I woke up dazed. There was a patch of dirt unbothered by snow on the side of the house, where a pretty red-leafed plant was growing next to me. I was worried I had crushed part of it with my fall. The world was blurry, and seconds passed by as minutes. The world went dark as I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, I heard the shrieking bellows of 1,000 souls, both human and animal. When I looked at the source of the hellish cries, I saw dozens of contorted limbs writhing as fire freed the souls trapped in the demonic vessel. Each of its heads displayed a unique skull, spazzing wildly as if it had forgotten what it originally looked like when it was birthed from the rankest bowels of hell. It began to run off aimlessly into the distance, as its body fought with itself, unable to decide which direction to go. That was the last memory I could recall from the night I lost everything. And now I lay here staring at a cheap, white-tiled roof, hooked up to a machine. I can still feel my leg. The nurses say it's called phantom limb syndrome and that it should go away or become mostly undetectable after the first year. I hope to God that whatever that thing was, it died along with my wife and dog. But something tells me it's still out there somewhere. I'm going to have to sell my land to pay for the medical expenses, but I can't ever truly leave until I know it's dead. And just when you thought it was safe, another terror comes crawling from the past. They were smelling. Even as a 6-year-old, I was smart and could easily survive on my own. Every day I would come home from school, all alone, eat what was left in the fridge, clean my room, and do my homework. After I've done my chores, I would always go outside and play with my friends or the dog Shinken, who was the nicest dog in the world. As I looked outside, I noticed that nobody was there, but it wasn't strange. The weather was bad, and the sky looked so gray that it could rain any minute. But even Shinken wasn't outside. He is a stray dog, which was really weird. But not even the bad weather or the strange absence of everyone could stop a small little girl like me from going out and having fun. After 5 minutes of running down the stairs, I finally made it to the yard. Even though there was nothing happy about a sandbox and a slide that we all were too afraid of to use, I heard there were ghosts under it. I actually felt pretty nice. Nice but boring. I really didn't know what to do. So I decided to just stand by the slide and look at the ground. After 10 minutes of daydreaming, I got woken up by a weird sound. It was not a sound that a human or an animal could make. It was not talking, screaming, meowing. It was just a sound. But even though this situation was everything but normal, the 6-year-old me wasn't scared. I was still in a good mood and a little curious about what I was hearing. And as I looked at the source of the sound, I saw them. And even though I met them for the first time, I understood that these were not humans, animals, or monsters. Just them. There was an it with legs and arms like ones of a marionette and white skin. There was an it with missing eyes and no real skin. There was an it with a mouth like a fish and limbs twisted as if they were broken, and even an it with white skin and a hole for a mouth. They were all smiling, and I smiled back, saying, "Hello." They continued to smile, and after 5 minutes of looking at each other, I decided to dig in the sandbox, so I said, "I will play in the sandbox," and started my work. At first, nothing much happened, but after some time, I saw something hidden in the sand. As I continued to dig it up, I finally saw what that was. First, I dug up a paw, then a tail, and after 2 minutes, I saw Shinken. "Oh, hello, Shinken," I said. "Shinken?" This is when I understood why the dog wasn't answering. And as I looked at my paranormal guests, I understood that they weren't smiling. I was very fast for 6-year-old, so I managed to run to my flat in 10 seconds and close the door on all keys. As I looked out of the window, I noticed that no one was there. No one except the dead dog who was once called Shinken. After some years, I've kind of forgotten about the incident. Life moved on and so did I. But one time I was sitting in my flat looking outside. There was no one but a small girl who was talking with the air, and after 5 seconds of looking at nothing, the girl decided to go to the sandbox. But no, she did not find a dead dog or even start digging in it. She just looked at me and smiled. I already knew that smile. As the screams faded, a new horror whispered its arrival. Red drops keep falling from my head. "Just don't drink or eat anything." The lab technician in Ohio blurted with that weighty authority that meant, "I ain't fucking around here, Jack." "Is that it?" I asked incredulously. "Well, that, and I'd recommend a hyperbaric chamber. And maybe a priest. It's amazing you didn't die in Cleveland, Jack." "Yeah, me and Howard the fucking Duck. Fucking toxicologists and their toxicology reports. Why didn't you tell me when it counted, Jack? Like 2 weeks ago. Fucking shitty coverage at my shitty job. Now it looks like my name is Drew because I'm in the DOA queue. It must have been those fucking spirulina smoothies. That bitch. Cyanide. Motherfucker duck. It all began a month ago with the headaches. Those were soon followed by chronic irritability and the Jake leg. I chalked it all up to just another stressful week on my shitty consulting job until I experienced what I later found out was vertigo. My job was high stress, but only due to my psychotic manager. But that's enough. I once saw Miguel kick a chihuahua at lunchtime, then laugh. He thought nobody was around, but I was coming out of the pisser and saw the whole fucking thing. And it was at a company team building picnic, no less. Anyway, Vera wouldn't let me quit my shitty job. Vera Costigan was my wife. Vera and her daddy were worth, well, she once put it like this, more than God. But I didn't need that much to quit. Don't be a worm, Warren. A man needs to stand on his own 2 feet. "I'll do me and you do you," she had once told me before she pulled away in her Bentley for another shopping spree at the Costigan Mall. So I kept chasing that paycheck. Vera was giving me a good discount, she said, but my share of the manse was just shy of $4,000 a month. That's a big enough nut that I didn't even push back when fate dealt me a hand almost worse than death. Emergency with a difficult client. Flying coach to Cleveland. Guess who? Yeah, was it really just last month I was working late night in that shitty hotel room in Cleveland? I'm only from back east, but one airline flight, Uber and client meeting later, and my psychotic manager, Miguel, was raging at me. Raging at me for not load testing a mobile solution I hobbled together fast and furiously under relentless pressure in my DMs. Then, in person. You can lose your job. Miguel snarked as I looked at the big generic 503 message on my screen. Maybe you should stay in the room until you figure out your mess. I wanted to say it, don't spray it. But instead, I tried to think what the issue could be. I only had to deal with 100 users or so. That shouldn't have crashed anything. I told you so, Miguel bellowed after the game. Then I felt it all spin out of control and didn't know what happened until later when I came to on a gurney. They kept me for observation and Vera flew to Ohio to be by my side. After a few days, a doctor named Zugsmith told me I could go back home and they'd be in touch. Vera flew me back to New York on her dad's private jet, and she sure was swell to me once we were back home. I was back at work after a few days, and even Miguel wasn't too much of a prick. For a few days anyway. Then the new deadlines came from Javier, and he passed them on to Miguel, emphasizing how he couldn't emphasize the urgency. And of course, one Miguel call later, I too felt the pressure. I was settling in for a long night of toil. I was stressed and had that anxious Sunday night feeling in the pit of my stomach, but it was also noticeably different this time. I was stress drinking these fucking chocolate superfood smoothies Vera kept giving me because she said it was good for my nervous system and that it would help me harmonize with all the negativity I clearly was struggling and floundering with. Vera loved to tell me I was floundering. That pendulum feeling in the pit of my stomach made me double over and say, Gar. This time it wasn't just my stomach, though. Evil rhythm was palpitating in my breast. I felt a beastly humidity in the air, like there was an invisible silverback attack to the soundtrack of Gene Krupa on crack, and it was all coming from under my hirsute chest. I shook my head. I was a big boy. I was sipping an espresso with a scoop of vanilla ice cream. Vera had brought me with a kiss an hour ago, and I saw no reason to stop. I had just stopped procrastinating with the weed pen, hoping to quell my nausea. Speaking of nausea, a voice in my head cajoled. It was time to review specs I had printed out, spread like a losing poker hand across the folding Staples table I used for a desk. I was sipping caffeine and trying to make heads or tails of Miguel's schizophrenic ramblings and diagrams when the first spot suddenly appeared, crimson and angry too. It made a splash that settled into a chaotic floral imprint reminiscent of Jackson Pollock or King Crimson. Who gives a fuck? Then another blood drop fell and settled into the same fractal Fibonacci stochastic portent. I recognized a pattern, a bad omen, a bad moon rising. It began looking like a bloody spirograph pattern. Vera, I screamed. All I heard was my own voice echo through the empty manse. The voice in my head said, the first time could be coincidence. The second time is a pattern. Third time, enemy attack, son. Enemy attack. Then my phone rang and my hallucination that looked like Sterling Hayden evaporated. I snuffed some bloody pulpy stuff that gave me postnasal pause. The phone kept ringing. More blood came out, but maybe a bit faster this time. I heard a strange buzzing in my ears. It crystallized into a sound like company town. I heard my teeth grinding without leave. The phone wouldn't stop ringing. I answered. It was Vera. Vera? I thought you were in the how. It's Daddy's town. Vera said over me with no preamble or context. We Costigans own this town, dope. We run everything from the police to the town council to the cell phone towers. I told you Daddy diversified away from arms. That's so war on terror. So yesterday. So. Vera's voice sounded like someone looks when they make vague Italian gestures. So you, Warren. She said my name like it was a dirty word. I wiped some blood away from my mouth and chin. Some slid in between my lips. It was salty like tears. What are you saying, Vera? I asked. Panic putting an arm around my shoulder that said, I'm not here to reassure you. You're such a dope, Warren. I just needed a patsy to get out of a marriage without jeopardizing Daddy's deal with Harvey and Abdul, and there you were, all dew-eyed and butthurt, divorced by that floozy Wada's name. I wiped some more blood away, then some more. You'll never get away with it, Vera. They have the report. Cyanide. That's Cleveland, not Costigan's Bluff. They didn't know how I got it, but I knew it was you. I just don't know why. Warren, you worm. Your baggage, that's out of style. I hate divorces. Being a widow, now that's really what makes me happy. I just really want you gone, and I don't want to pay you one thin dime, you worm. You bitch, I'll call the FBI. I'll go to the press. Reddit. No, you won't. Those reports out of Cleveland, Daddy's people are already on it. That lab technician is toast along with his so-called records. Who's gonna miss Warren the worm? Who? Who's gonna ask questions? You were nervous, a pansy, a heart attack kid, and I was up on my hind legs. I would drive to the next town. I ran out of the house, but I never made it past the front door. It was stuck. I ran to the back sliders, and there they were, a pack of snarling German shepherds. Must have been a dozen, and they all looked at me and licked their chops. The doors are locked from the outside, so you won't be going anywhere soon, and your IP is now blocked from the outside world. Any last words, worm? Bullshit. No bullshit. You're like North Korea. You're fucking sealed in my town. My rules. I'm God, Warren. You gotta sing a sad song now, Wormsy. Now, you worm, get hip to the click. The call ended. I bled some more. I tried to call the police, 911, everything, but all my calls are getting blocked. I think they hacked my phone. Those dirty Costigans. This dirty company town. This sleep might be the big one, but the real horror? It was just around the corner, waiting for its turn. The sound in the walls. I moved into the house last month. It was one of those charming old colonial homes, with creaking wooden floors and ivy creeping up the walls. A dream for someone like me, who always loved the idea of history clinging to every corner. The realtor mentioned it was over 100 years old, and though it needed some repairs, it felt like the perfect place to call my own. The first night in the house was quiet, almost too quiet. It's funny how you never notice the absence of sound until it's gone. I didn't hear the hum of cars in the distance, no people walking down the street, just pure silence. It should have been peaceful, but instead, it left me with a nagging feeling of unease. It started on the third night. I was lying in bed, drifting between sleep and wakefulness, when I heard a faint scratching sound. I sat up, groggy, trying to figure out where it was coming from. I thought maybe it was just a mouse or some other rodent. Old houses are prone to pests after all. But as I listened more closely, it sounded like something bigger, something deliberate. It was coming from the walls. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was probably just an animal. Maybe a raccoon or a possum had gotten into the crawl space. But every night, the noise got worse. What started as a faint scratching soon turned into what sounded like whispering. It was so faint I couldn't make out the words, but there was something disturbingly human about it. I called an exterminator, thinking that whatever was in there needed to be dealt with. They came, searched the house, and found nothing. No signs of rodents, no nests, no entry points. They assured me there was nothing in the walls. But the sounds continued. One night, the whispering grew louder. I sat up in bed, heart racing, straining to hear. I couldn't deny it anymore. The voices were there, just behind the wall of my bedroom, and they were speaking. Words slurred together in low, guttural tones, too quiet to understand but unmistakably there. Then something tapped against the wall. It was slow, methodical, like someone knocking from the other side. I jumped out of bed and pressed my ear to the wall, trying to hear. The whispering stopped, and for a moment, there was silence again. But then the wall shifted. I don't know how else to describe it. It felt like something inside the wall moved, something alive. I could feel the vibrations under my hand, like a deep, hidden pulse. My stomach churned, and I backed away slowly, afraid to look away, but terrified of staying too close. I hardly slept that night. The next day, I called a contractor to check the walls, hoping it was just faulty wiring or some structural issue. He tore open part of the wall where I'd heard the noise, but all he found was the usual wood, insulation, nothing out of the ordinary. He patched it up, and I pretended for a while that it was enough to make me feel safe. That night, I decided to record the sounds. I left my phone on, with a voice recording app running, propped up against the wall where the sounds had been the loudest. I lay in bed, the sheets pulled tight around me, and waited. The whispering returned, but this time it was clearer. The words still made no sense, like they were spoken in a language I couldn't understand. But as I listened through the thin walls, I realized something horrifying. The voices weren't just random, they were responding to me. They would grow louder when I moved and quiet when I stayed still. At one point, I couldn't take it anymore. I shouted, "What do you want?" The whispering stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the pounding of my heart. Then, a single word came through the wall. Clear as day. You. I froze. The air in the room felt thick and oppressive, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. I grabbed my phone, too scared to play back the recording, and ran out of the house. I've been staying in a hotel ever since, but I can still hear the whispering in my dreams. I know I have to go back eventually. It's my home, after all. But I don't know if I can, because whatever is in the walls wants me, and I don't know how to stop it. The house may be silent now, but somewhere else, the walls are screaming. Found out how the world really works. I decided to do a little urban exploring to get my mind off my mother-in-law's cancer. She had been sick for half a decade, and it had made home life dreary. I was there for my wife, but there was only so much I could do comfort her, as she was always one to deal with this stuff on her own. You can only get told to fuck off so many times before you start to take the advice. My wife liked company, but preferred to grieve on her own, as she felt it fostered self-sufficiency. Whether I agreed or not, this did give me time to pursue my own hobbies, such as acting, like exploring abandoned buildings like I was 15 again. I hopped over the rusted gate and ran into the decrepit building to avoid any chance of getting caught. I'm not sure why my interests became so morbid after her mom got ill. Maybe this was my subconscious way of coping. Perhaps my mother-in-law meant more to me than I realized. Whatever the reason, I had gotten past the point of being afraid of anything and felt I had to keep upping the stakes of my explorations to keep myself from thinking too much. So on I went to use danger as a form of escapism. I was looking through rooms in order to find any freaky mysteries buried by the hospital to give this more of a video game vibe. I managed to break open what looked like an old chief of medicine's office. Just the normal stuff. Carved pentagrams, swastikas, insults, 666, and a bunch of other symbols that looked like they came from an 80s metal album. A bit disappointed, I decided to sit for a bit. Many of these buildings didn't scare me at all, and I needed a break as I came here straight from work and haven't had time to rest or eat. I've explored enough to know where the most important secrets in these places hide. It all came through the heart of the facility. Where the heart of the building was depended on the specific facility. Factories were a mystery due to the excessive number of nooks and crannies. Homes, despite their size, might have been worse. With schools and offices, you just had to search the right desk. But hospitals were always the chief of medicine's office. I guess there were too many unstable patients to put it anywhere else. Scrambling through files, I was about to just head home when I saw something interesting. I picked up a folder with the symbol of a circle and lines standing around it. I removed a document, and from what I read, there happened to be a special group in this hospital. A cult, I figured. There was a makeshift map on the back, which made me think there must have been something pretty cool in this room. I didn't find this in the trash. It was in a drawer I had to jimmy open, which told this might have been an urban explorer's dream come true. You learn fast what is useful. I took a map of the hospital and followed the instructions from the document, which led me to the 3rd floor towards the end of the hallway. I made my way to the destination, only to find a wall. Thinking the wall might be hollow, I began to punch and hit the wall with anything I could find. However, the wall was solid with no sign of paint or anything that would imply something used to be here. That didn't stop me, as I have become an expert on finding hidden entrances. One of the reasons I brought the map was to navigate these hard-to-find areas. I figured the entrance to this room might have been on the other side, near the stairwell. I went around to the stairs and found that the room on the other side of the building. There was a secret entrance on the side of the stairs, opposite the hallway I was in. Wanting to feel the thrill of uncovering a cool conspiracy, I climbed in the entrance, hoping I might make a difference in this world. I found myself in a pitch-black room that smelled like a large janitor's closet. I searched around until I found a sign of light or a breeze that could indicate a way out. I found a door and made my way out, and found myself in what felt like a small gymnasium. I heard a small yelp and headed for the sound. I had been exploring so much that stuff that should have terrified me, such as screams or signs of crimes, only intrigued me and pushed me forward. I turned a corner to find a room with a small light in it. I shoved my way in like I've been there before. I saw a small group of people, some men and some women, who were surrounding a shaking patient. I wondered if I walked into one of those live procedures that med students would watch. For a brief moment, I thought I entered a part of the hospital that was still in operation and was about to leave when I noticed that the patient was awake. I yelped, causing the group to turn around. I started to run, but the door slammed shut with the leader standing right behind me. "You can't leave yet." What? Please, have a seat." As he turned to walk away, a seat materialized behind him. Not knowing what to do, I sat hoping that if I cooperated, I wouldn't be in the patient's place. I could maybe leave and call the authorities. I know what this looks like. You think we're monsters who are getting our rocks watching a man suffer. A cult of hedonists with no motive but smile in the face of another's pain. I assure you, we're not monsters, and we don't enjoy this. We have to do this. So you're addicted? The world depends on this man's suffering. I wanted to run for the hills, but thought I wouldn't get very far. I sat still, trying not to panic. I know it's crazy, but we have seen things, as bad as the world is. If we don't keep this man in pain, the chaos revealed will be so much worse. And it doesn't happen fast. It will be a gradual turn. It won't be an explosion, more like a corrosion, a steady stream of misevents that eventually leads to our destruction. Why do you think this? How does this work? I say, trying to stall as long as I can. It's difficult to explain, but every person, whether it be positive or negative, releases energy. The energy of an individual interacts with another's energy, which creates cohesion or friction that keeps the world in balance. This is why some people love each other while some that can't stand a person. Every unlikable person, as well as every town favorite, serves a purpose. That being said, most people don't have enough energy to have a noticeable effect on their own. Their energy just comes off as normal human interaction, and the ones who are deemed more emotional and likable cause a small reaction and are mixed in the sea of energy created by every person. However, some people produce enough energy to really make difference. Cult leaders, dictators, and visionaries of all stripes can use that energy to control the wave of energy. This doesn't worry us, as most rarely ever discover their abilities, but a very rare few produces enough to affect the world all on their own. For these people, their thoughts and opinions don't just carry more weight, but creates a force that doesn't require appealing to society's emotions. Their energy affects the abstract energy of others and create a domino effect of influence, which can be mirrored by anyone without having any idea they are being influenced. It is almost like a possession. The ones who have the righteous religious status must be worshipped, while the ones who are malevolent must be despised. For this creates a balance of good and evil that keeps us a moral check. The ones who the most energy is not able to control it, it must be controlled for them. This is David Eklund. He is what we call a negative unified force. His torture brings stability that we otherwise wouldn't have. What stability? The world is in chaos. If this were real, I think you guys found the wrong person. The level of chaos we'd have without this man's pain would be astounding. You think the political chaos is bad now? Imagine riots that can actually bring down countries. Imagine what comes up after is basically a black hole that just destroys. No one would believe in anything anymore. Everything would be about trying to destroy. What we have now is not chaos. How do you know this? This is ready. We've all had experiences with our doubt. This wouldn't just happen all at once. It always starts out with a relatively small incident. Maybe someone gets shot. Maybe his family or friends take exception to that and attempt revenge. Maybe that retaliation hits the wrong person, causing a political group to think it was a hate crime, which in turn causes a bit of protests, which causes an extremist group to act out, leading to riots from the protesters. Maybe the protesters get careless and injure a general in the crowd. Maybe this causes the police and military to get involved. This chaos would be much worse than what we've experienced the last few decades. This is a huge claim. Come on, we aren't monsters. We've all wanted this man to be free, but have experienced some of these mild calamities. There just isn't a way around it. I don't know. I hear a woman interject. I came here 2 years ago. I rescued him and took him to a shelter. I got a call from my mother that my sister had been committed. My sister has always had problems, so I figured it was a coincidence. My sister tried to eat one of the nurses, and she didn't make it, so my sister was put on trial. She originally got a light sentence due to her mental state, but was changed to the death penalty the next day. We were all confused at the sudden change of heart, but the judge wouldn't hear it. He said this cultish behavior has to stop. They put her to death the next week. This made my sister's case the fastest execution in modern U.S. history. This caused an extremist church to bomb the State House, which caused a far-left group to react and shoot the pastor of their church. This the first time I've heard about political violence in my city, and the groups are normally on the opposite side of this issue. My town started splitting up into factions, and I began to feel like I was in an actual civil conflict. I remembered what this group had told me and decided to give their theory a try. I found Dave and promised him a meal at my place. I drugged him, put him in car, and brought him back here. The next couple days, I saw both groups disband. People in the town lose interest, their factionalism, and my sister's sentence was cleared as a mistrial. My family was awarded $500,000 for the mistake. Maybe it was naive, but I became a believer pretty quick, and even more so once I saw what happened when the others went through similar trials. So, you are a part of this now? That's part of the deal. You make the choice, then you torture him. I torture him mentally. He thinks I'm his lover, who's also a prisoner, and every few months I make him think we're escaping only to bring him back here. I hate it, but using my energy to keep his in check is now my biggest priority. But the leader chimes in, and now you're a part of it as well. You have seen him, and whether you like it or not, must partake in his torture. Now come, you need to take in your duty. He grabbed my hand and pulled me to what appeared to be an aberration made by the art department of The Exorcist. He was bloody, pale, and missing teeth. His hair was mangy and missing clumps. The man wasn't even shaking. It was like he felt reserved to his fate. Now please, make the choice. How will you torture him? How will you utilize your negative spirit? We'll give you 20 minutes. The group walks into a side door and leaves me to my decision. I wasn't about to get inducted in this cult. I didn't care if I were risking my life. I needed to save a human from a fate worse than death. I grabbed the knife off the table, cut his ropes, and tried to pull him up. Come on, I'm getting you out of here. The man could barely stand after being tied up for so long, and I had to act as a crutch. We made our way to the door I came from. I had to be cautious, as I wasn't sure if the cult had backup in the hallway I came from. I peeked out and noticed a couple robed members at the end of the hall. They were hard to make out in the dark, but I could see them, and luckily, they were on the opposite side I came from. So I shuffled with this dude toward our exit. I was curious as to why their security was this lax, considering the nature of their crimes. I guess entropy really takes its toll. We made our way in the stairwell to the main hospital, where we sat for a few minutes. How long have you been in here? I don't know. He seemed listless. I couldn't blame him. Are you from this area? I'm not sure. I've been here for years. I barely remember what happened the day I was taken. I don't have much a grasp on time anymore. These guys really do this to you all these years? It's been rough. It hasn't all been brutal. Sometimes I get a week off to recover, but I think that's so I can feel the pain fresher. They pretend to be my friend, then crack me a bunch, then I wake back on the table. We sat there for 30 minutes just talking about his situation and where he wants to go. I received a text from my wife. Her mom's health took a turn for the worse. She wasn't texting like she normally did. She told me she might take her own life. Just as I was about to message her, my brother texted me about how most of the houses on his block are foreclosing and his neighbors are becoming homeless. His house is safe, but people are demanding to stay there. He is contemplating leaving as the neighborhood is becoming chaotic. At this point, my anxiety had gone to overdrive. I'm not superstitious, but the coincidence was ridiculous. Come on, let's get a move on. I helped him up when I got a ping on my phone. My wife tried to kill herself. It was then that superstition took hold. But this guy isn't getting tortured because my family is in pain. I couldn't do that to anyone, no matter the cost. If this thing was real, I'll just kill myself. I took us through the hole that led back to the main hospital when I received another text. My brother got stabbed by his wife. This was understandable. She was stressed. We were walking in the hallway that led to the exit, and I got a text from my wife's sister. My wife apparently had a contagious blood disease that had begun to infect the hospital. Their family was quarantined. Hey, wait. There was odd security. Let's go back this way. I had taken the dude back to the room. The cult was standing there waiting. You were quicker than most. Most people spend at least another 20 minutes pretending they're going to save him while they make up their mind. Shut up. This is horrific. We've all had to make the decision. It cannot continue if a newcomer doesn't make the choice. The members pull the fella up and tie him. Now, you must make the next move. He hands me a knife. The first cut must be the most painful. As one door closed, another one opened, and what lay behind it was far more terrifying. I keep receiving 911 calls for emergencies that haven't happened yet. Series 1 know that another call is coming today. I don't know when, and I don't know why, but it will. They have been the only constant in the chaotic maelstrom of decision and consequence that has been the last few weeks of my life. Oddly reassuring knowing I can look forward to them, yet completely powerless to know exactly when they will occur, or more importantly, what I should do about them. Any doubt is gone. I have seen too many things to believe it is just some trick or coincidence. I don't want to believe, but I have to now. I know I have a responsibility to do something. I just don't know what that is most of the time. I am tired and overwhelmed, but someone has to do something, and that someone is me. I was chosen to know what will happen and given the burden of stopping it, or just bearing witness. I suppose I understand how ignorance can be bliss now. Sorry, I should elaborate and tell you what has been happening to me these last few weeks. I know it might sound crazy, but bear with me. The first call was 2 weeks ago. I was just getting off work and had to take care of something that was equal parts annoying and expensive. I needed to pick up a new phone since I managed to completely break my old Galaxy by dropping it the day before. The screen shattered, of course, but worse, some damage to the internal components completely broke it, and it would not boot up or do anything other than display a blank screen. As I was about to head out to purchase my new device, the seemingly dead phone sprang to life and started ringing. Not with my own ringtone, but a strange chime I had not heard before, and was not sure if it was even in the list of pre-programmed ringtones. I was confused how it could still ring, but was momentarily relieved, since I figured it might still work after all. I could not really afford anything better at the moment anyway, so if I could, I would save the expense. Putting aside the decision to keep my shattered phone a while longer or not, I answered the call. I was surprised and disturbed when before I could even say hello, an panic-stricken voice cut me off. Help. Oh God, please help, someone stabbed him. They stabbed Michael, please send help. It sounded like someone was trying to call the emergency line, and somehow it got sent to my broken phone. I was confused, and I tried to explain to the distraught person on the phone that I was not emergency services. I am sorry. I know it sounds like a real emergency there, but you need to dial 911 and get help. I don't know who this is, and I can't track the location. This is a personal cell phone, not 911. Before I could try and explain more, I was cut off. What do you mean? I did call 911, I need help. Someone stole our car and stabbed my boyfriend, Michael. We need help now. Get a real dispatcher or something, please. He is losing so much blood. We need help now. We are near the park on, what was it? She paused, likely confirming the address. We are on 4th Ave and Beckett Street. I think, please send help. I did not know what I could do. I had tried to suggest they call 911, but they sounded sure that they had. I did not know how to tell the panicked woman that I couldn't help. I finally decided on a plan and told her, "All right, ma'am, try and stay calm. I will try and call emergency services myself and send them there. Please try and call 911 again over there and see if it routes you correctly so someone can help. What can I tell them your name is?" There was a pause, and the voice on the other line spoke again. "It's Kendra. Kendra, what?" Static interrupted her response, and after a moment, the line went dead. I tried to call 911, but after that call, my dead phone had died once again, and it was unable to make even an emergency call. I hope that whoever that Kendra woman was got hold of emergency services. I had no idea how I had gotten the call, but either way, they really needed help, and I sure was not an EMT. I thought they likely got through, since I did not get another call. But the more I thought about it, the more concerned and responsible I felt. I considered the location she gave. I knew that park. It was not too far from where I was, so I figured I would go and check and make sure that they got through to 911 and someone was there on scene to help. I drove out to the park and found the corner of the park by 4th and Beckett. Not many people were around since it was fairly late in the evening. Certainly no signs of a stabbing or carjacking on this street corner. Since no one was around, I started thinking that maybe I had been the victim of a prank and that no one was here. It might have just been some elaborate crank call meant to rile people up about emergencies for some kind of sick entertainment. I felt upset by being fooled, but also relieved that no one was really in trouble, and I decided to head home. The Verizon store was closed by that point, so I would have to try again tomorrow. I stuffed the Verizon coupon I had saved and hoped would help discount a new phone for me back into my pocket. Having scribbled the address that Kendra had given me on the back of the paper, I started to feel silly for having gone out there. The next evening after work, I was planning to go buy the overpriced replacement for my phone again. As I got into my car to leave, I fumbled in my pocket for the coupon I had received and had written the address from the prank call the day before on. It was not there. My heart sank. It was a coupon for $100 off on a new Galaxy phone, which, considering how much they cost, was not a huge percentage, and I would have to finance it anyway. Still, $100 was $100. I still had a while before the store closed, so I decided to check back by the park. I thought maybe I may have dropped it there when I had gotten out to look for the so-called crime scene. It was a stupid idea. I knew that. I figured that unless someone was going to buy a phone, they might not have picked it up, and it could still be there. I drove back to where I had been the previous night. There were more people around this time. A few joggers, some bike riders, and people walking the trail. I parked and got out of my car and started looking near where I had been standing the night before. The whole idea was stupid, but if it could save me a bit of money, I would go for it. As expected, after fumbling around for a few minutes, I could not find the paper anywhere, and I started walking back to my car. I saw a young couple walking hand in hand back to the parking lot as well. They had arrived back at their car, and the gentleman opened the door for his lady. I thought the gesture was very sweet, which made the next few moments even more horrifying, as he closed the door and started to the driver's side. A figure dressed in all black jumped out of the nearby bushes and shouted at the man. I couldn't make out the words from where I was, but he was holding something. And when the gentleman reached into his pocket, the figure in black lunged forward and attacked. He seemed to stab the gentleman several times, and I heard a scream from the woman who had just emerged from their car. She was still screaming and rushed towards the fallen man, and I thought I heard her shout, "Michael, no!" I stood there frozen, unable to act. I knew I should help, but I was paralyzed by the sudden brutality and horror of the situation. Before I could move, the man in black peeled out of the parking lot in the couple's car. They remained where they were. Her screaming continued, and she held on to him. The sound had finally snapped me out of my confused and terrified daze, and I raced over to try and help. As soon as I approached, the woman looked up at me. Her hands were covered in the man's blood, and she begged for help. "Help, call 911. He's been stabbed, my Michael, he's been stabbed. I fell back in confused shock. The voice was familiar. The name was too. That was the woman from the phone call yesterday. It sounded exactly like her. There was no mistaking it. I couldn't understand how it was all happening in that moment. My confused reverie was interrupted by the woman shouting me back to my senses. Don't just stand there. Please, we need help. I did not know how to respond, but I managed to stutter out a meek, My phone's broken. I am so sorry. Maybe I can find help. As I backed away, trying to figure out what to do, a jogger had happened by and raced over to help. She sat down with them and was assisting in stabilizing Michael. She had given her cell phone to the woman who seemed to be calling 911. As she finished dialing the number, I felt an odd tingling in the air, and suddenly my broken phone vibrated and a notification bell chimed. I sat there dumbly watching everything unfold, his disbelief. After a brief delay, I heard her speak, and I was not prepared, though perhaps I should have been, for what happened next. Help! Oh God, please help, someone stabbed him. They stabbed Michael, please send help. I felt an odd thrumming of electrical energy from the phone as she spoke, and I knew what she was going to say next. What do you mean? I did call 911. I need help. Someone stole our car and stabbed my boyfriend Michael. We need help now. Get a real dispatcher or something, please. He is losing so much blood. We need help now. We are near the park on, what was it? I unconsciously mouthed the words that followed, since I had heard them less than 24 hours before. We are on 4th Ave and Beckett Street, I think, please send help. Another brief pause, and then she would say her name. The buzzing and thrumming from the phone stopped moments after she said her name. It's Kendra Wallace. Hello? Hello? Is anyone there? Please send someone. He is going to bleed to death, please. She continued screaming into the phone and then went back to Michael prone form, while the jogger who had come to help attempted to call emergency services again. It sounded like she had gotten through, as was giving the location to someone on the phone. When an ambulance arrived, I left the scene. I couldn't handle the insanity of what I had just experienced. How in the hell did I get a phone call about all of the things that had happened that night, the day before? I fell into my car and gripped the wheel and tried to process the insanity of what had just happened. I had no idea how any of this was possible. As I tried to keep from hyperventilating, I heard another notification on my phone. I had received a text message somehow. Despite the messenger app not functioning, it had a message screen displayed with one unread message. I tried to see if any other apps or anything would work, and it would not navigate to anything else. The only thing I could do was to open the thread. It left me even more confused than I had been before the message just read. Come on, were you even trying? Better luck next time. See you around. I had so many questions. Chief among them was, who the hell was M? And how did they know about what had happened? Before I had time to consider the madness of the situation, my phone started to ring again in the same weird chime from yesterday. I had a feeling I knew what would happen if I picked up. Holding my breath and steeling myself, I answered the call. The darkness didn't end with their story. It only deepened with the next. My wife, I came back from work. I parked my car and then noticed my wife waiting for me. I got out of the car. Holding hands, we entered the house. She took a seat on the couch. I bought some glasses. My wife grabbed my hand. I was happy. We talked. As she spoke, I was amazed. She knew so many things. We held hands. We kissed. Then I got a message on my cell phone. It was my wife, telling me she had to stay overtime at work and she'll get home in 3 hours. I got on my feet and stood there, confused. My wife, like being, asked me what was wrong. I made the mistake of telling her about the message I got. At that moment, her eyes turned fully black with no pupils. She jumped on her feet. I ran. A light bulb exploded. I kept running. She approached me. I hid in the bathroom. I could hear that thing roar and pound on the door. The door handle was moving rapidly. The door was shaking very violently. I squeezed myself through the bathroom window and jumped into the courtyard. I made a run for it to the car. I entered it. My wife appeared with a huge kitchen knife. I backed off and ran her through. I smashed the vehicle into the gate but failed to break it. The monster was approaching. The car didn't move anymore. No more gas. I blocked the car doors. The fake wife began hitting the car while roaring and hissing. I realized I had to stop her before my real wife got home, or else that thing might harm her. I got out of the car. I pushed the monster aside and made a run to the basement where I held my shotgun. I got there. The enemy arrived. Its body is twisted in inhumane ways. I fired the weapon again. The woman crawled backward on the wall and onto the ceiling. I fired my shotgun, but she turned into multiple shadows that began to spread all over the walls. I ran to the house and grabbed a Bible. I began reading from it and praying. Shadows moved across the wall, forming terrible shapes. The lights flickered. The chairs and the table were moving back and forth. The shadows converged into the room to form the same entity that looked like my wife. I kept praying. Suddenly, the entity turned into a giant shadow that flew right through the window. I did it. I was now safe. My real wife arrived. I told her everything. She hugged me. I told her how scared I was and that I was so glad it was all over. "Who said it was over?" asked my wife. Then her eyes turned fully black, and she laughed. But not in a way a human ever could. I ran again. Another wife arrived, the real one. The fake one made 2 knives float into her hands. I grabbed the shotgun. My wife grabbed it and told me to lure it to the mirror upstairs. The thing followed me. I was cut by her knives, which she wielded like an ancient warrior. Me and my wife prayed. I fired the weapon, each shot driving her closer to the mirror. The mirror absorbed the entity, and my real wife quickly covered it. We hugged. From then on, that mirror will always stay covered, and we try to avoid getting close to it. And just when you thought it was over, another story begins, and it's far worse.